It began with a telegram, not a bomb, not a bullet, a few carefully rewritten words. Within weeks, Europe was on fire. One empire would collapse, a new superpower would rise, and the world would never be the same again. This is not just a war story. This is the moment France lost its crown and Germany forged its empire in blood and steel. Paris will starve, an emperor will be captured, and in the glittering hall of mirrors at Versailles, a ceremony will take place that will haunt France for generations. This is the entire story of the Franco-Prussian War, and once it begins, you won't believe how fast everything unravels. Chapter 1. The Tension Before the Storm. Paris, autumn of 1870. The streets were quiet, too quiet. In the heart of the city, beneath the golden arches and towering facades, something invisible hung in the air. It wasn't fog. It wasn't the bite of an early winter. It was fear, cold, creeping fear. Far away, in a palace of iron and calculation, a man named Otto von Bismarck sat at his desk. His eyes weren't on Paris. They were on Europe. And in his hands, he wasn't holding a sword. He was holding a map. France, Prussia, Austria, Italy. The old order of Europe was shifting. The chessboard had been laid. And France, proud, radiant, and ruled by an aging emperor, was standing on unsteady feet. But none of that mattered to the people of Paris just yet. The cafes were full. The theaters were lively. The empire still wore its crown. Yet, like the slow groan before a building collapses, something was beginning to crack. This is how it always begins, not with an explosion, but with a whisper. To understand the storm that was coming, we need to rewind just a few years to a time when Europe was caught between dreams of unification and nightmares of collapse. Let's start with Prussia. In the mid-19th century, Prussia wasn't yet the Germany we know today. It was a powerful kingdom in the north of Europe, militarily disciplined, culturally rigid, and hungry for something more. For centuries, the German people had lived divided, scattered across dozens of small kingdoms, duchies, and city-states. But change was coming, and at the center of it stood Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck was not a soldier. He didn't lead men into battle, but his weapons were far more dangerous. He wielded words like daggers. He maneuvered like a general. Only his battlefield was diplomacy. He had one goal: to unify the German-speaking peoples into one great empire. Not through ideals, not through peace, but through what he called blood and iron. And standing in his way was France. France had long been the dominant power in Western Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte had reshaped the continent with fire and ambition. Even after his fall, France remained a symbol of elegance, culture, and strength. But by the late 1860s, the shine had begun to fade. Napoleon III, nephew of the great Bonaparte, sat on the throne. He had crowned himself Emperor of the French in 1852. At first, he was popular. He brought stability. He built railroads. He modernized Paris. But under the surface, there were cracks. His war in Mexico had failed. His influence in Italy was slipping. And worse still, he was aging. Sickly. Tired. France, once the lion of Europe, was growing nervous. You see, Prussia's rise wasn't just a threat to France's power. It was a threat to her pride. Imagine watching your neighbor's house grow taller and taller, casting a long shadow over your own. That's what it felt like in Paris. Prussia had crushed Austria in the War of 1866. That alone had shocked the world. Austria had been a dominant force in Central Europe for centuries. But in just 7 weeks, Prussia broke her. Bismarck had isolated Austria politically, provoked them militarily, and struck with terrifying speed. Now, the message was clear. Prussia was the rising sun. And France? France was yesterday's glory. The French newspapers were filled with growing anxiety. Politicians debated endlessly in the salons. Could France allow Germany to unite under Prussian leadership? What would happen if Bismarck succeeded? A unified Germany, powerful and industrialized, could dwarf France in population, production, and military might. Napoleon III knew this. His advisors knew it. But what could they do? Then came the spark. Not yet a flame, but enough to light the fuse. In 1870, the Spanish throne became vacant. Spain was in chaos after a revolution, and in their search for a new monarch, someone proposed a candidate from the House of Hohenzollern, the same family that ruled Prussia. That meant a Prussian prince could soon sit on the Spanish throne. For France, this was unthinkable. Imagine your two neighbors, one already growing too powerful, suddenly forming an alliance. That's what it looked like to France. Surrounded, isolated, threatened, Napoleon III sent his ambassador to Prussia. The demand was simple. The Prussian king, Wilhelm I, must guarantee that no Hohenzollern would ever take the Spanish throne. Not now, not ever. Wilhelm received the ambassador politely. They spoke at a spa town called EMS. The king agreed to the request in a limited way. The crisis, it seemed, was over. But then, Bismarck struck. He took the telegram summarizing the king's conversation with the French ambassador and edited it. Not with lies, just with precision. Like a surgeon, he cut and shortened the message, just enough to make it sound insulting, arrogant, disrespectful. Then he published it. In Paris, the public was outraged. It looked like the Prussian king had mocked their ambassador, mocked France. In Berlin, people felt the same, that France had tried to humiliate their monarch. In a matter of days, war fever swept both nations. Angry crowds filled the streets. The drums of nationalism began to pound. On July 19, 1870, France declared war on Prussia. But what few in Paris realized was that this was exactly what Bismarck wanted. He had played the long game. He had predicted their reaction. He had ensured France would look like the aggressor, so that the southern German states, still hesitant to join Prussia, would now rally to defend the German cause. In one stroke, Bismarck turned his scattered German neighbors into allies, and he made France look like the villain. The chessboard was now in motion. But here's the tragedy. France wasn't ready. Their army, while proud, was outdated. Their command structure was a mess, full of political appointments, rivalries, and confusion. Their mobilization plans were scattered and slow. Prussia, on the other hand, was a machine. Their rail network was built for speed. Their army was drilled for precision. Their generals worked under a centralized plan, devised years in advance. Every soldier knew where to go. Every supply train knew its destination. It was as if one side was marching with paper maps and old pride, while the other came armed with a blueprint and a stopwatch. And yet, there were still hopes in Paris. War could unify the country. Victory could restore France's glory. Napoleon III, though ill, believed that one bold strike into Germany could turn the tide. But hope is not a strategy. In August, the first battles would begin. Small towns on the French-German border would see the clash of bayonets, cannon fire, and cavalry charges. Blood would soak the fields of Alsace and Lorraine, and what began as a diplomatic crisis would become a national catastrophe. But in these early days, no one could see how quickly it would all fall apart. The French Empire still stood. The banners still flew. The uniforms still gleamed in the sunlight. But beneath it all, the clock was ticking. Because once the first shot was fired, everything would unravel, faster than anyone expected. And by the time the leaves began to fall, so would an empire. Chapter 2. Bismarck's Master Plan. January of 1871. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Golden chandeliers flicker above a sea of polished boots and iron-gray uniforms. At the center of it all stands Wilhelm I, crowned Emperor of Germany, Kaiser of a new empire. The French, defeated and humiliated, stand only miles away behind broken walls and starving streets. But this defining moment, the birth of an empire, did not emerge from cannon fire or cavalry charges. It began years earlier, quietly and deliberately, in the mind of one man. A man who understood that nations are not built on battlefields alone, but in shadowed rooms where words and whispers wield power. That man was Otto von Bismarck. This was his plan. Bismarck was no king, no battlefield commander. He bore no crown and led no armies into battle. Yet, few men in European history have shaped the world as quietly and effectively as he did. His tools were not speeches or public rallies. His weapons were timing, silence, and careful manipulation. Known as the Iron Chancellor, Bismarck was a master of realpolitik, a system of politics based on practical and material factors rather than ideological or ethical premises. He trusted power above all else, raw, unapologetic power wielded with ruthless efficiency. Born in 1815, Bismarck had watched Europe tear itself apart through revolutions and wars. Unlike dreamers or idealists, he believed that history moved not by moral ideals, but by force and cunning. When Bismarck became Chancellor of Prussia in the 1860s, he held a clear and unyielding vision: to unite the fractured German states under Prussian leadership. The German people were scattered among dozens of small kingdoms, duchies, and city-states, each with its own traditions, loyalties, and fears. Some leaned toward Austria's influence. Others still looked to France or clung to independence. Bismarck knew that unification would not be achieved by kindness or treaties alone. He needed a common enemy to bind the Germans together, a threat that would push them into alliance and obedience. The enemy, he decided, would be France. Step by step, he set his plan in motion. In 1864, Prussia and Austria went to war with Denmark over the small duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. This conflict was short, sharp, and tightly controlled. It was a test of strength, but more importantly, a way for Bismarck to measure Austria's power and willingness to cooperate. 2 years later, in 1866, he accused Austria of violating their agreement regarding the duchies and provoked a war that lasted only 7 weeks. In this swift campaign, Bismarck crushed Austria's influence over the German states, shattering its hold on Central Europe. Yet, after such a decisive victory, Bismarck made a surprising choice. He spared Austria from harsh punishment. He refused to annex Austrian territory or humiliate the defeated empire, opting instead for restraint. He knew that crushing Austria outright would create lasting resentment and potentially dangerous enemies. His aim was not vengeance, but silence. Austria, wounded but unbroken, retreated quietly. With Austria weakened, Prussia took control of the North German Confederation, a loose alliance of northern German states under Prussian leadership. The southern German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, watched from the sidelines with suspicion and fear. These states were proud, largely Catholic, and wary of Prussian dominance. But Bismarck was patient. He did not rush. He understood that fear could be a more powerful motivator than loyalty, and he would use it. France watched all of this with increasing alarm. Napoleon III, emperor since 1852 and nephew of the famed Napoleon Bonaparte, saw the rise of Prussia as a direct threat to French power and influence. France had once dominated Europe, but now it seemed to be shrinking in the shadow of a growing German state. Napoleon had tried to balance diplomacy with demands, asking for territorial compensation and guarantees of peace, but Bismarck remained silent, unmoved. Each French demand made France appear weaker, desperate even. The French public grew restless, their pride wounded, while Napoleon's health and popularity declined. Then came the crisis that lit the fuse, the Spanish throne. Spain, still shaken by revolution, was searching for a new monarch. Among the candidates was a member of the Hohenzollern family, the same dynasty that ruled Prussia. To France, the prospect of a Prussian prince on the Spanish throne was a nightmare. Imagine two neighbors already uneasy with each other, and suddenly the second neighbor moves into your other neighbor's house as well. France felt surrounded, isolated, and encircled. Napoleon demanded that the Prussian king, Wilhelm I, promised that no Hohenzollern candidate would ever ascend the Spanish throne. Wilhelm's response was calm but firm. He refused to give such a sweeping guarantee, though the candidate himself withdrew from the race to ease tensions. It seemed the crisis might be over, but Bismarck had other plans. He took the telegram from Wilhelm, describing the conversation with the French ambassador, and edited it. Carefully, surgically, he trimmed and rephrased, changing the tone just enough to make the king's response sound dismissive and insulting. Bismarck then released the edited telegram to the press. The effect was immediate and explosive. In Paris, outrage swept the streets. The French felt insulted and humiliated. In Berlin, patriotic fervor flared. The public in both countries saw themselves as defending honor, yet the reality was that Bismarck had crafted a war from words alone. France declared war on Prussia on July 19, 1870. To the outside world, France appeared the aggressor, rushing to attack a neighbor. But Bismarck's plan was working perfectly. The southern German states, long hesitant to join Prussia, now rallied to defend Germany against French aggression. They united for the first time under Prussian command. France, confident and proud, marched into battle believing in a quick victory. They recalled past glories, convinced their soldiers and generals would prevail. But they underestimated the new Germany they faced, disciplined, united, and driven by years of careful planning. Prussia was no longer a kingdom. It was the core of a rising empire, forged by strategy as much as by sword. Throughout the war, Bismarck remained in the shadows. He did not command armies on the battlefield. Instead, he coordinated logistics, diplomacy, and propaganda. He carefully managed relations with other European powers, assuring Britain of his peaceful intentions, reminding Austria to remain neutral, and convincing Russia that stability would be maintained. Meanwhile, German troops advanced deeper into French territory, moving with efficiency and resolve. What years of negotiation could not accomplish, war had done overnight. Now, for the first time, German troops from all states, north and south, would fight under a single command. A unified army, a unified cause, and France had walked right into it. But Bismarck wasn't finished. Not yet. He had no interest in destroying France. He wanted to break her resistance, but keep her intact. Too much punishment, and the world would unite against Prussia. Too little, and Germany's future would remain uncertain. This was the tightrope he walked. Throughout the war, Bismarck stayed behind the lines. He coordinated with generals, but rarely interfered. He dealt with kings, but held his own power in secret. He arranged food, supplies, reinforcements, and, most of all, he managed perception. While French newspapers blared headlines of national glory, Bismarck shaped Europe's view of the war. He sent letters to British, Russian, and Austrian leaders. Each one painted Prussia as a victim, defending itself against French arrogance. Each one softened concerns and sowed doubt about French intentions. To Britain, he spoke of peace. To Austria, he spoke of restraint. To Russia, he promised stability. And all the while, German troops marched deeper into French soil. When Napoleon III was captured at Sedan, it was Bismarck, not the generals, who handled the fallout. He refused to deal with the new French Republic. He demanded surrender. And as Paris dug in for a brutal siege, Bismarck waited. Cold, steady, unmoved. By January, the French were starving. The war was nearly over. But Bismarck had one more move to make. In the Palace of Versailles, built by French kings, filled with mirrors that once reflected French power, he crowned Wilhelm I as Emperor of Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm. It was not just a political act. It was a message, a declaration, a warning. France's pride had been taken and reshaped into Germany's crown. And Bismarck? He stood at the edge of the crowd, not cheering, not smiling, just watching, always watching. But the war wasn't over just yet. The French people were not finished fighting. And Paris still stood. The Iron Chancellor had built his empire with words and traps. But the fire that had been lit was not yet done burning. The next chapter would not be written with ink. It would be written with blood. Chapter 3, The Spanish Throne Crisis. In the summer of 1870, Europe stood on a knife's edge, and the smallest spark threatened to ignite a devastating fire. That spark came not from armies poised at borders, nor from weapons drawn in battle. It came from a vacant throne in Spain, a kingdom torn by revolution and chaos, searching for stability amid the ruins of its monarchy. But the choice of a new ruler would unravel the fragile peace of the continent and thrust two great powers into war. Spain, battered by internal turmoil, was desperate for a monarch who could restore order and calm the restless nation. After the overthrow of Queen Isabella, the country was in a political freefall, with factions vying for influence and authority. To many, the solution seemed simple. Invite a member of a royal family with strong ties to Europe's powers to ascend the Spanish throne and bring legitimacy to the fragile regime. And so the name of a Hohenzollern emerged, a distant relative of King Wilhelm I of Prussia, belonging to the very dynasty that had reshaped German politics in recent years. To many in Spain and beyond, the choice was practical. The candidate was a man of noble blood, untainted by the chaos, and capable of stabilizing the nation. But to France, this was an existential threat. France's fears were not merely about Spain, but about the balance of power in Europe. Imagine standing in a room already crowded with powerful neighbors. Suddenly, one of those neighbors moves even closer, taking a seat where you thought none would dare. For France, a Prussian prince on the Spanish throne meant encirclement. Germany, already rising like a colossus in the heart of Europe, would now have influence stretching from the North Sea all the way to the Mediterranean. Napoleon III and his advisors saw the danger clearly. The prospect stirred panic within the French court and government. To them, it was more than politics. It was about survival and honor. France could not allow what they saw as a German encroachment on the Iberian Peninsula. The very idea of a Hohenzollern king in Spain ignited fury across Paris, stirring public outrage and nationalist fervor. The French government demanded assurances, explicit guarantees that no member of the Hohenzollern family would ever be considered for the Spanish crown. To communicate this, Napoleon sent his ambassador to meet with King Wilhelm I, who was resting at the spa town of Ems, seeking respite from the pressures of state. The meeting was meant to de-escalate tensions and find a diplomatic resolution. Wilhelm received the ambassador with courtesy, but stood firm. He refused to issue a binding, perpetual promise preventing any future candidacy. However, the Hohenzollern candidate withdrew his name voluntarily, hoping to ease the crisis. At this point, many hoped the matter would end quietly. But Bismarck, ever the strategist, saw opportunity. When Wilhelm sent a telegram back to Berlin summarizing the encounter, Bismarck edited it, not by fabricating lies, but by trimming and rephrasing, altering the tone just enough to make the king's response seem brusque and insulting. He then released the edited telegram to the press, igniting a firestorm of public outrage in both France and Prussia. In Paris, the telegram was received as a declaration of insult, a humiliation that demanded immediate response. Newspapers and crowds alike called for strong action, painting the Prussian king as arrogant and disrespectful. In Berlin and across Germany, patriotic pride surged, and the people rallied around their king, viewing France as the aggressor provoking conflict. This manipulation of words, the power of perception over reality, was Bismarck's greatest weapon. The diplomatic crisis spiraled into war within days. On July 19, 1870, France declared war on Prussia, believing it was defending its honor and position. Yet, in Bismarck's design, France had become the aggressor, pushing the southern German states, previously cautious or even hesitant, into alliance with Prussia. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and others swiftly joined the conflict on Prussia's side, uniting the German states under one cause and command. France, isolated and encircled, had walked into a trap of Bismarck's making. Behind the scenes, Bismarck continued to control the narrative. He sent messages to other European powers, portraying Prussia as a defender against French aggression, soothing fears, and securing neutrality. Meanwhile, German armies mobilized with efficiency and purpose, ready to confront the French forces on the battlefield. The Spanish throne crisis, a seemingly minor dynastic dispute, had exploded into a full-scale war, one that would reshape Europe's map and power balance forever. What began as whispers in palaces and subtle edits in telegrams now roared across battlefields and shattered empires. The next chapters would reveal the human cost of this conflict, the battles, the sieges, the heartbreak. But the seed of war was sown in that summer of 1870, in the halls of power and the pages of a telegram, where words became weapons and a crown became a spark that lit the world ablaze. Chapter 4. The EMS Dispatch. The moment came like a thunderclap, though no guns were fired, no soldiers charged. It was a message, a telegram, a handful of words that would echo through history and ignite a war. The EMS Dispatch. Imagine a quiet summer afternoon in the spa town of EMS, a peaceful place where King Wilhelm I of Prussia sought rest and refuge from the burdens of his crown. Far from battlefields or the roaring crowds of the capital, the king sat quietly, surrounded by the stillness of the forests and the gentle murmur of the nearby river. Yet, even in this calm, the winds of war were already howling. News had arrived of a delicate meeting between the king and the French ambassador. Napoleon III's government demanded assurances that no member of the Hohenzollern family would ever take the Spanish throne. A simple diplomatic mission intended to cool tensions, avoid conflict, and preserve peace. Wilhelm received the ambassador politely but firmly. He declined to issue a permanent promise, but the candidate for the Spanish crown had withdrawn voluntarily. The conversation was respectful, measured, with no harsh words exchanged. The king sent a telegram back to his chancellor in Berlin, recounting the encounter with clarity and calm. But this was not the end of the story. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, received the telegram. He saw in it not a peaceful resolution but an opportunity, a chance to inflame passions, to turn diplomatic friction into a full-scale war that would unite Germany under Prussian leadership. Bismarck took the king's message and edited it. Carefully, calculatingly, not by inventing lies, but by trimming and reframing, changing the tone just enough to transform a polite refusal into a sharp insult. He made it sound as though Wilhelm had brusquely dismissed the French ambassador, and that the ambassador had responded with undue aggression. The edited dispatch was then released to the press, both in France and Germany. The effect was immediate and electric. In Paris, the news was met with fury and humiliation. The French public felt slapped in the face, their pride wounded. Newspapers blared headlines of insult and defiance. Crowds gathered, angry and demanding action. The government, pressured by public outcry and national honor, saw war as the only answer. In Berlin and across the German states, a wave of patriotic pride surged. Citizens rallied around their king and their country, now convinced that France had insulted them first, that Germany must stand strong and respond. The southern German states, which had long hesitated to join Prussia, found their fears of French aggression confirmed. They aligned themselves swiftly, joining the cause with unity and determination. This was the power of words, the power to shape perception and manipulate emotions. Bismarck understood that history is often not written by facts alone, but by how those facts are told and heard. The EMS dispatch was a masterstroke of political theater, crafted to kindle anger and justify war. As France declared war on July 19, 1870, the stage was set for a conflict that would change Europe forever. But behind the headlines and marching armies, the question lingered. How much of this war had been born from true hatred, and how much had been forged by a single edited message? The answer would be revealed in blood and fire, on battlefields far from the quiet town of EMS. Chapter 5. France declares war. The 19th of July, 1870, dawned over Paris like the calm before a storm. Yet, beneath the gilded facades of the city, a tempest of emotion was building. Anger, pride, fear, and hope colliding in the hearts of millions. That day, France declared war on Prussia, a decision that would change the fate of nations forever. The streets thrummed with anticipation. The people's cheers echoed through the grand boulevards, their voices swelling in unison for a cause they believed was just and necessary. But beneath the thunderous applause lay an uneasy truth. This war was not born of simple hatred or inevitable conflict. It was the result of carefully crafted provocations, political calculation, and the desperate desire of an emperor clinging to his legacy. Napoleon III, once a charismatic leader who had brought stability and modern reforms to France, now stood at a crossroads. His empire, inheriting the grand ambitions of his uncle, the great Napoleon Bonaparte, was under pressure from all sides. The rise of Prussia, its unyielding military reforms, its unification of German states under one banner, posed a direct challenge to French dominance in Europe. The emperor's health was failing, and his popularity waned, but his need to demonstrate strength had never been greater. The EMS dispatch, that edited telegrams sent from EMS, became the perfect pretext. It stoked French national pride, transforming simmering unease into fiery outrage. Yet, the decision to declare war was as much a gamble as it was a declaration of principle. France's military, once a symbol of European might, had suffered from years of neglect and outdated tactics. Its generals were divided by rivalries and political intrigue, many slow to adopt the new technologies and strategies that modern warfare demanded. Artillery, rail transport, and rapid mobilization had changed the face of battle, and while Prussia had embraced these innovations with ruthless efficiency, France lagged behind. Despite these shortcomings, the French people believed in victory. The memory of past glories, the grandeur of their culture, and the swelling patriotism buoyed their hopes. As the war was declared, soldiers prepared to march to the front lines, carrying with them not only their rifles and bayonets but the hopes of an entire nation. Families gathered to say tearful goodbyes, mothers clinging to sons, wives kissing husbands, children waving at fathers who might never return. The streets of Paris were filled with patriotic fervor, bands played stirring marches, and the tricolor flag flew high over government buildings and homes alike. There was a collective belief that France would triumph swiftly, that the invincible spirit of the nation would carry them through the trials ahead. But war is rarely kind to illusions. While enthusiasm surged, the machinery of conflict lurched into motion with a grim, indifferent logic. French soldiers soon encountered the harsh realities of modern battlefields, swift movements, coordinated attacks, and the deadly precision of Prussian artillery. The initial engagements revealed cracks in French command and control, miscommunications, and the deadly cost of underestimating an enemy prepared and united in purpose. Meanwhile, across the Rhine, the southern German states answered the call with remarkable speed. Kingdoms like Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden, once wary of Prussian ambitions, now embraced unity in the face of a common foe. Their armies mobilized with discipline and determination, their railways funneling men and supplies efficiently to the front. For the first time in centuries, German-speaking peoples fought together as one, their collective identity forged in the crucible of war. Back in Paris, news from the front arrived in fragments. Victories celebrated, defeats mourned, but always the steady march forward of Prussian forces. The mood began to shift from confident expectation to anxious concern. Despite this, the government clung to hope, issuing optimistic proclamations even as reports from battles like Wissembourg and Spitzeren painted a grimmer picture. The fall of Napoleon III at Sedan, a crushing blow to French morale, had yet to come, but the seeds of disaster were already sown. The declaration of war was not just a political act. It was a turning point that thrust ordinary men into extraordinary circumstances. Soldiers who had never known violence faced the brutal truths of combat. The roar of cannon fire, the thunder of cavalry charges, the cries of the wounded and dying. Civilians endured the fear and uncertainty that come with war, the rationing, the loss, the endless waiting for news. And as the battle lines stretched across the fields and forests of eastern France, the true cost of pride and miscalculation became clear. The war was no longer a symbol of national honor. It was a grim test of survival. For France, the thunderous applause that greeted the declaration was only the first note in a tragic symphony of struggle and sacrifice. In those early days, few could foresee how quickly fortune would turn, how the confidence of a proud nation would be shattered by the relentless advance of an enemy that combined military innovation, strategic genius, and unbreakable unity. And above all, how the consequences of that fateful declaration would echo far beyond the battlefield, reshaping borders, rewriting alliances, and sowing the seeds of conflicts yet to come. As the first shots rang out and armies clashed, the question hung heavy in the air. Had France rushed headlong into a war it was not ready to fight? The answer would come not in speeches or telegrams, but in the blood-soaked fields of battle. Chapter 6. The Armies Mobilize. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the streets of Paris, mingling with the anxious whispers of families and the sharp bark of military orders. The drums of war were no longer a distant echo. They were pounding at the very heart of France. But as French citizens scrambled to answer the call, a stark contrast was unfolding on the other side of the border. The Prussian war machine was already in motion, precise, efficient, and terrifyingly organized. The battle for Europe would not only be fought with guns and cannons, but with the speed and discipline of armies mobilized to perfection. In France, the call to arms was met with chaos. Thousands of men, farmers, shopkeepers, students, clerks, were summoned to don uniforms and take their places in regiments, many for the first time in their lives. The initial excitement of answering the nation's call was quickly tempered by confusion. Military orders were tangled, railways clogged with troop movements, and weapons were in short supply. In many towns, local commanders struggled to assemble their forces, sometimes delayed by poor communication or outdated plans. It was as if the nation was awakening to war, but with a heavy fog clouding its steps. The French army structure added to this disorder. It was a patchwork of regular soldiers, reservists, and National Guardsmen, each with different training and levels of readiness. The process of mobilizing such a diverse force was slow and uneven. While some regiments managed to organize quickly, others faced delays, with men waiting days for transport or proper equipment. The rail system, crucial for moving troops swiftly, was old and inefficient compared to Prussia's, creating bottlenecks that frustrated commanders and soldiers alike. The French people, caught in this whirlwind, faced not only the fear of war, but the frustration of disarray. Letters sent from the front tell of young soldiers longing for clear orders, families wondering if their loved ones would ever reach the battlefield, and commanders battling against time and bureaucracy. In cafes and marketplaces, conversations turned to worry. Would France's famed army be ready when the guns finally sounded? Meanwhile, across the border in Prussia, the scene was dramatically different. Years of preparation had transformed the German states into a mobilization powerhouse. The Prussian General Staff, led by the meticulous Helmuth von Moltke, had perfected the art of moving armies with clockwork precision. Every railway line was mapped, every regiment scheduled, and every supply train ready to roll at a moment's notice. It was a symphony of logistics that Germany had rehearsed repeatedly, a well-oiled machine that could turn civilians into soldiers almost overnight. The Prussian soldiers, many of whom had undergone compulsory military service, were not strangers to discipline and order. Their training emphasized quick assembly, coordinated movements, and rapid deployment. Regiments boarded trains with military efficiency, marching off to rendezvous points with purpose and confidence. The rail network, modern and meticulously maintained, allowed troops to move hundreds of miles in hours, a staggering advantage over their French counterparts. The contrast in mobilization went beyond mere numbers or trains. It was a reflection of two very different societies. France, with its proud but politically divided population, struggled to coordinate a massive military effort. Prussia, by contrast, had forged unity through military preparedness and centralized control. The German states, once fragmented and suspicious of each other, now acted in concert, bound by a shared goal and a clear command structure. This difference would prove decisive. The rapid Prussian mobilization allowed German forces to seize the initiative, striking before the French army could fully assemble or coordinate its defense. Early battles demonstrated how speed and organization could shape the outcome before a single shot was fired. France's delay meant missed opportunities, vulnerabilities, and a growing sense of panic in its leadership. For the soldiers themselves, mobilization was more than logistics. It was the moment when civilian lives shattered, replaced by the uncertainty and terror of war. Young men boarded trains with hopes of heroism, but also with fear they struggled to hide. Mothers clutched their children as fathers marched away, the uncertainty of return hanging heavy. The air was thick with emotion, pride, anxiety, and the haunting question of what lay ahead. As the armies moved toward confrontation, the stakes could not have been clearer. The difference between Prussia's ironclad mobilization and France's faltering response would shape the war's earliest and bloodiest engagements. It was a race against time, where every hour counted, and failure to act swiftly could mean the difference between victory and crushing defeat. The French forces, still struggling to find their rhythm, braced for the storm. Across the border, German soldiers prepared with cold resolve, confident in their preparation and command. The great clash of the Franco-Prussian War was no longer a question of if, but when. Chapter 7. Marching into Lorraine. The dawn was cold and gray as the French forces began their advance into Alsace-Lorraine, the border region that would become the war's first bitter battleground. With heavy boots pounding the earth and the clatter of muskets and artillery echoing through the mist, thousands of soldiers moved forward under banners waving high. The spirit was fierce, pride, determination, the hope of reclaiming what many French believed was rightfully theirs. But beneath this surge of patriotism lurked a dangerous truth. The army was not as prepared as it believed. What should have been a confident push quickly became a staggered, disjointed march into chaos. The region of Alsace-Lorraine was more than a patch of land. It was a symbol of national identity, a prize steeped in history and cultural significance. For France, it represented lost honor and the bitterness of previous conflicts. For the Germans, it was a vital frontier to defend. The French government hoped that an early strike here would unsettle the Prussians, disrupt their plans, and perhaps turn the tide before German forces could fully assemble. Yet, almost immediately, the French advance stumbled. Coordination between units was poor, messages between commanders were delayed or misunderstood, and the fog of war descended rapidly. Orders were contradictory or arrived too late. Soldiers marched without clear objectives, sometimes duplicating efforts or leaving critical positions undefended. It was as though a great ship was setting sail with sails torn and compass broken. Movement was possible, but direction was lost. One of the earliest battles, at Wissembourg, revealed the consequences of these failings. French troops, moving into position with hope, were surprised by a sudden and fierce Prussian attack. Communication failures meant reinforcements were delayed, and what began as a strategic advance became a desperate defense. The French line broke, soldiers fled, and the dream of a quick victory was shattered in a matter of hours. Among the troops, fear and confusion spread. Men who had trained together, fought alongside friends, suddenly found themselves isolated, unsure of orders, and facing relentless enemy fire. Letters from the front tell of the chaos, soldiers caught in muddy fields, officers shouting conflicting commands, and the anguished cries of the wounded. The horror of battle was no longer distant. It was raw and immediate. Behind the scenes, French commanders struggled to regain control. The political pressure to show strength was immense, but the reality on the ground was fragmented. Rivalries between generals, outdated communication methods, and the slow pace of decision-making handicapped the response. Meanwhile, the Prussian forces, benefiting from efficient planning and rapid mobilization, pressed their advantage. They exploited gaps in the French lines, moved reinforcements quickly, and maintained the momentum that chaos had denied their opponents. The failure in Alsace-Lorraine was not just a military setback, it was a blow to French morale. Public confidence, once soaring with the declaration of war, began to waver. News of defeat traveled back to Paris, dampening celebrations and sparking fear. Families awaited letters that often never came, while soldiers faced the grim reality that pride alone would not win battles. Despite the confusion, French soldiers fought with courage, often under impossible circumstances. Their valor in the face of adversity was a testament to their commitment, even as their leadership faltered. In the forests and fields of Lorraine, men risked life and limb for a cause that was slipping beyond their grasp. As the German armies regrouped, and tightened their grip, the question lingered. Could the French recover from this early disaster? Or was the campaign into Lorraine the beginning of a long, painful decline? The answer would be written not just in strategy rooms or government chambers, but in the blood and mud of the coming battles. The French advance into Alsace-Lorraine had ignited the war's first flames, but the fire was not yet fully kindled. Ahead lay a long, grueling conflict that would test the limits of endurance, will, and leadership on both sides. Chapter 8. The Battle of Wissembourg. The morning air hung heavy with anticipation over the quiet border town of Wissembourg. What was once a peaceful, sleepy village suddenly found itself at the center of history, a place where destinies would be forged in blood and fire. It was here, on the 1st of August, 1870, that the Franco-Prussian War would shed its first drops of blood, and where the fragile hopes of a swift French victory would begin to unravel. The clash was swift but brutal. A relatively small force of French soldiers, stationed to guard the border, found themselves facing a larger, well-prepared Prussian army determined to strike hard and fast. The French troops, a mixture of regulars and reservists, were ill-prepared for the onslaught. Many had little battle experience, their uniforms still fresh and their nerves raw. Across the fields and among the village streets, the soldiers faced the sudden terror of battle, gunfire ringing, cannons booming, men shouting orders, and the terrified cries of the wounded. The battle began early, with the Prussians launching a surprise attack. Their soldiers moved with deadly precision, taking advantage of superior numbers and better coordination. The French defensive lines quickly began to falter under the pressure. Commanders on the French side struggled to issue clear orders amid the chaos. Soldiers, confused and scattered, fought fiercely but without the unity needed to hold the ground. It was a scene of confusion and courage mixed, ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances. For the Prussians, Wissembourg was a test of their well-honed strategy. The German commanders had spent years perfecting the art of rapid mobilization and coordinated attacks. Their infantry advanced steadily, supported by artillery that hammered French positions. The battle was a demonstration of the power of preparation and discipline. Soldiers moved like parts of a machine, each fulfilling their role with grim determination. Yet, amid the smoke and carnage, human stories unfolded. French soldiers wrote hurried letters to loved ones, some unaware if they would survive to send them. A young private, trembling but resolute, clutched a locket from his sweetheart as he prepared to charge. A Prussian officer, hardened by years of training, hesitated for a moment upon seeing the fear in the eyes of the French defenders, reminded that war was not just strategy, but human suffering. The fall of Wissembourg was a harsh blow to French morale. It was the first clear indication that this war would be far more difficult than many had imagined. The defeat opened the door for further German advances into French territory, setting the tone for the brutal campaign that lay ahead. Yet, even in defeat, the French fought with valor, their courage a testament to the complex emotions war evokes: fear, duty, pride, and despair. As the dust settled on that bloody day, questions loomed large. Had France underestimated the resolve and strength of its enemy? Would the lessons of Wissembourg be heeded, or would they be repeated in the terrible battles to come? The answers remained hidden in the fog of war. The small town of Wissembourg had become the first stage of a great conflict. Its fields soaked with blood, its streets echoing with cries of the fallen. The battle was only the beginning. The true cost of this war, on soldiers, civilians, and nations, was yet to be fully revealed. Chapter 9. The Fall of Alsace, Battle of Worth. The morning sun rose over the rolling hills near the small town of Worth, but there was little to warm the hearts of the French soldiers gathered there. Instead, a chill of dread swept through their ranks. What began as an opportunity to regroup after earlier setbacks would soon turn into one of the most devastating defeats France would face in the entire war. The Battle of Worth, fought on the 6th of August, 1870, marked not only a military disaster, but a collapse of hope for a swift and honorable victory. The fields that day were soaked in confusion, chaos, and blood, and the echoes of retreat would haunt France for months to come. The French army, still reeling from the shock of Wissembourg, had attempted to consolidate its forces in Alsace, hoping to form a strong defensive line against the advancing Prussians. Commanders pushed to organize their troops, but lingering disorganization and miscommunication plagued their efforts. Soldiers were exhausted, their spirits frayed by continuous movement and mounting losses. In contrast, the Prussian forces approached with confidence, their ranks swelling with reinforcements and their leaders eager to press the advantage. As the battle commenced, it became clear that the French were outmatched not only in numbers but in coordination. The Prussians deployed with precision, their artillery opening fire to devastating effect. Massive cannons roared, sending shells tearing through French lines, disrupting formations and sowing panic. The French soldiers, many still untrained or hastily assembled, struggled to maintain their ground under the relentless bombardment. The chaotic fog of war descended quickly. Orders from French commanders became muddled or delayed, and units found themselves isolated, fighting without clear support. Some regiments fought bravely, standing their ground against waves of German infantry, but others faltered, their ranks breaking and scattering in the face of the assault. Retreat turned into rout. The once proud French forces were pushed back, their lines collapsing in places, the ground slipping from beneath them. Among the soldiers, fear and exhaustion clashed with determination and loyalty. Letters from those caught in the fight speak of terror as shells exploded nearby, of comrades falling beside them, and of the desperate hope to survive and regroup. An officer, seeing his men falter, tried to rally them with cries of duty and honor, but even his voice was lost amid the thunder of battle. Civilians in nearby villages watched helplessly as the front lines crumbled, fearing the violence that would soon reach their homes. The retreat from Worth was not merely a tactical withdrawal. It was a disaster that unraveled the French campaign in Alsace. Roads and bridges became clogged with fleeing soldiers and retreating artillery, while commanders struggled to maintain order. The loss shattered morale and exposed the vulnerability of French defenses. For the German commanders, it was a moment of triumph, proof that their strategies and preparations were overwhelming the once feared French army. Yet, even in defeat, the French continued to fight fiercely in pockets, refusing to surrender without resistance. Their courage in the face of calamity spoke to a deep sense of duty, a commitment that transcended the chaos around them. But the tide had turned. The fall of Alsace was a blow from which France would struggle to recover. The region, rich with symbolic importance, now lay open to the German advance. Back in Paris, news of the defeat struck like a thunderbolt. The government's initial hopes for a quick and decisive war faded, replaced by fear and uncertainty. The public, who had cheered the declaration of war just weeks before, began to grasp the brutal reality that lay ahead. Letters from the front arrived with grim accounts, and families faced the terror of loss and separation. As the dust settled over Worth, the future seemed ominous. The battle was a turning point, one that revealed not just the strength of the enemy but the weaknesses within France's own ranks. The war was no longer a simple clash of armies, but a struggle for survival. The next moves in this deadly game would determine not only the fate of Alsace but the future of Europe itself. The fall of Alsace was just the beginning. The French army, battered and broken, now faced the long road back from disaster, while the Prussian forces pressed their advantage with grim resolve. What followed would test courage, leadership, and the will of a nation caught in the unforgiving grip of war. Chapter 10. The Battle of Spicheren. The morning of August 6, 1870, broke over the rugged heights near Spicheren with a deceptive calm. The French army, holding the high ground along the ridge, believed their position would serve as a natural fortress against the invading Prussian forces. Yet, beneath this quiet confidence lay a fragile reality, one of fractured command, fractured communication, and the creeping shadows of confusion. What unfolded that day was not just a clash of armies, but a painful lesson in how the chaos of war can unravel even the strongest defenses when leadership falters and messages go astray. The French forces were composed of a mix of experienced soldiers and hastily called up reservists, many of whom had been thrust into combat with little time to prepare. Their commanders, caught between the pressure to hold their ground and the challenges of coordinating diverse units scattered across the ridge, struggled to maintain a unified defense. Orders meant to reinforce critical points arrived late, or were misunderstood entirely. Some regiments withdrew prematurely, leaving dangerous gaps that invited disaster. The battle quickly turned into a fragmented series of desperate skirmishes, each unit isolated and vulnerable, fighting not just the enemy, but the creeping dread of disorder within their own ranks. Meanwhile, the Prussian army advanced with methodical precision. Years of military reform had honed their ability to move as a cohesive whole. The commanders coordinated infantry assaults with the booming support of artillery batteries, which unleashed devastating barrages against the French lines. Shells tore through trees and earth alike, scattering defenders and turning the battlefield into a smoky, chaotic maze. The German soldiers pressed uphill steadily, driven by disciplined training and clear command. Where the French hesitated or faltered, the Prussians exploited every opening with ruthless efficiency. Amid the cacophony of gunfire and exploding shells, the human experience of the battle was stark and poignant. French soldiers faced the nightmare of close combat, caught between instinct and obedience. A young private gripped his rifle tightly, his hands trembling as he fired into the haze, aware that retreat was impossible but unsure if survival was likely. Officers shouted commands, trying desperately to rally their troops, but their voices were often swallowed by the roar of battle and the panic spreading through the ranks. On the German side, medics moved tirelessly, stained with blood yet determined, their presence a grim reminder of the battle's toll. The tide turned decisively when a crucial miscommunication struck the French left flank. Reinforcements, desperately needed to hold that vulnerable sector, were delayed and confused. The Prussians sensed this weakness and swiftly maneuvered to outflank the defenders. What should have been a secure position crumbled under pressure. Panic rippled through the French lines as units broke and fled, turning a tactical setback into a chaotic retreat. The heights that had promised safety became a trap of desperation, with soldiers scattering under fire, pursued relentlessly by the advancing enemy. This defeat at Spicheren was catastrophic not merely for its immediate loss of ground, but for what it revealed about the French war effort as a whole. The bravery of individual soldiers was undeniable, but courage alone could not compensate for the fatal flaw of disjointed communication and flawed command structures. For the Prussians, the victory was a powerful affirmation of their military reforms, centralized planning, clear lines of communication, and disciplined execution. It was a glimpse of a future where such advantages would decide the fate of nations. Back in Paris, the news of Spicheren deepened the sense of dread. What had once seemed a war of pride and swift victory was now a brutal test of endurance and adaptability. Families clung to hope, even as letters from the front became scarce or bore grim tidings. The soldiers themselves, exhausted and shaken, faced the growing uncertainty of a campaign that was no longer theirs to control. The Battle of Spicheren stands as a stark, painful lesson in the brutal realities of war, where valor is essential, but discipline and clear communication are the true weapons of victory. As the smoke cleared and the wounded were tended, it became clear that the war ahead would demand not just courage but unity, clarity, and unyielding resolve. The fate of France and Europe rested precariously on these fragile threads. Chapter 11. The German War Machine. In the early days of the Franco-Prussian War, a force unlike any France had previously faced began its relentless march across the landscape. A war machine fueled by innovation, discipline, and industrial power. This was not just an army. It was the embodiment of a nation's will transformed into steel and steam, precision, and planning. At its heart lay the genius of the Prussian General Staff, the intricate network of railroads threading across the country, and the thunderous might of Krupp's steel artillery. Together, These elements created a military powerhouse that would soon change the course of European history. The Prussian General Staff was a revolutionary concept, a small group of strategic minds whose work was as vital as the soldiers on the battlefield. Unlike traditional commanders who often made decisions in the fog of war based on intuition or limited information, the General Staff operated with almost scientific precision. They studied maps, intercepted intelligence, and coordinated troop movements with meticulous timing. Imagine a grand chessboard where every piece moved in perfect harmony, not by chance, but by careful design. This system allowed Prussia to anticipate enemy moves, mass forces quickly, and strike with overwhelming power before opponents could react. For the French, whose command structure was more fragmented and less efficient, this was a game-changing advantage. Another pillar of the German war machine was the extensive railway network. While other armies relied primarily on slow, exhausting marches, the Prussians harnessed the power of steam trains to transport entire armies across hundreds of miles in mere hours. These iron veins pumped life into the military, delivering troops, weapons, and supplies rapidly to wherever they were most needed. It was like having a high-speed courier system for war, capable of reinforcing weak points instantly or surprising the enemy with sudden attacks far from expected battlefields. This mobility was not just a logistical feat. It was a strategic weapon that left the French scrambling to keep up. Complementing this was the devastating firepower of Krupp's steel artillery. Krupp's cannons were masterpieces of industrial engineering. Crafted from hardened steel that could withstand immense pressure, they fired explosive shells farther, faster, and more accurately than anything France possessed. The deafening roar of Krupp guns on the battlefield was a symbol of German industrial might, each blast tearing through enemy lines and fortifications with terrifying efficiency. For the French soldiers who faced them, these guns were both a physical and psychological force, shaking morale and fracturing defenses with relentless bombardment. But beneath the iron and steel was the human element, soldiers, officers, and planners driven by duty, pride, and the heavy burden of war. The troops who boarded those trains carried with them a mixture of resolve and fear, knowing that each battle could mean life or death. Commanders worked tirelessly, poring over maps late into the night, aware that their decisions would shape not only the fate of their armies but the future of a nation. The German war machine was not an impersonal juggernaut. It was a reflection of human will harnessed with unprecedented precision. For France, confronting this formidable force was like trying to stem a flood with fragile barriers. The French military's slower mobilization, fractured command, and inferior artillery left them vulnerable at every turn. Each Prussian victory was a reminder that modern warfare had changed. The battlefields now belonged to those who combined technology, strategy, and speed. The French, proud and valiant, found themselves on the defensive, forced to adapt quickly or face disaster. Yet, the power of the German war machine was not absolute. It moved through a world full of uncertainty, where weather, terrain, and human error could all influence the outcome. The coming months would test not only the mettle and steam but the resilience and spirit of the men who fought beneath their banners. Could human courage and innovation coexist, or would one triumph over the other? The answer remained to be seen as the war machine rolled onward, its wheels turning inexorably toward destiny. Chapter 12. Paris watches in panic. A single headline flashed across the front page: "Defeat at Spicheren. Our brave soldiers retreat." The ink was barely dry, but the shock rippled through Paris like a thunderclap. It was August, 1870, and the proud capital found itself clutching at hope as news from the front grew darker by the hour. The streets buzzed with whispers and rumors, yet the newspapers shouted patriotic fervor from every corner. Their bold, booming headlines promised victory and valor, but beneath those printed words, Paris trembled in quiet dread, a city caught between defiance and despair. Paris was a city of light and culture, a place where artists painted dreams and cafes overflowed with laughter. But now, under the weight of war, that vibrancy was tinged with unease. The relentless updates from the battlefield seemed almost unreal, like distant echoes from a nightmare the city hoped to wake from. Families huddled around small radios and gathered in salons, straining for any glimmer of good news. Mothers prayed for sons they had sent away. Lovers exchanged anxious glances. The bravado of public speeches and newspaper slogans struggled to mask the fear that gnawed at the heart of the city. The French press played a complicated role in this drama. Editors and journalists were torn between their duty to inform and the need to maintain morale. The papers blasted declarations of heroism and assured readers that France's cause was just and unbreakable. Headlines screamed of unyielding courage, and France will prevail. Yet, buried in the columns were sobering details, reports of retreat, mounting casualties, and logistical struggles. This dance between truth and hope shaped the public's mood, turning newspapers into battlegrounds of information and propaganda. As Parisians went about their daily lives, the tension was palpable. The markets were busy, but conversations often turned to hushed tones when war was mentioned. Soldiers marched through the streets, their faces etched with exhaustion and determination. The city's famed boulevards, once symbols of pride, now felt like fragile lines of defense holding back the tide of uncertainty. The city seemed to hold its breath, aware that the front lines were moving ever closer, that the war was no longer a distant event but a looming shadow over every doorstep. Government officials worked tirelessly behind closed doors, their faces marked by worry. Strategy meetings, hurried telegrams, and emergency councils became daily rituals. Leaders grappled with the enormity of the crisis, balancing the need for order with the raw fear spreading among the population. Each decision carried weight beyond politics. It was about survival, about the future of a nation whose identity was entwined with Paris itself. In private homes, the war's emotional toll was deeply personal. Letters from soldiers arrived in fits and starts, some filled with hopeful words, others scarred by the grim realities of battle. The uncertainty was a relentless torment, each day a question mark. Children clung to parents. Parents searched for answers in the silence. The city's spirit flickered, sustained by resilience but threatened by despair. Amid this storm, artists and writers sought to capture the city's mood, painting scenes of resilience, composing poems of defiance, and chronicling the everyday bravery of citizens facing an unknown future. Parisians found small acts of kindness and courage, neighbors sharing food, strangers helping the wounded, threads of humanity woven through the fabric of fear. Yet the question loomed large and dark. Could Paris hold against the advancing forces? Would the city's spirit be enough to withstand the coming storm? The answer was not yet clear. As the capital waited, watched, and prayed, the fate of France hung in a delicate balance between hope and despair. Chapter 13. The Road to Sedan. The sun rose over a landscape scarred by retreat and despair. French soldiers, once proud and confident, now moved like shadows, tired, starving, and haunted by the chaos that had turned hope into hardship. Their footsteps echoed along the roads leading to Sedan, a fortress city that was meant to be a sanctuary but was rapidly becoming a trap. The road to Sedan was not just a march. It was a grim journey toward an uncertain fate, a slow, heavy march through fear, exhaustion, and the cruel realities of war. From the earliest battles, the French forces had been pushed back again and again. Wounded and weary, their numbers thinned by casualties and desertion, the troops struggled to hold their ranks together. Supply lines were stretched to breaking point. Food, ammunition, and medical aid were scarce. Hunger gnawed at stomachs, fatigue weighed on limbs, and morale slipped like sand through fingers. The soldiers knew they were moving toward a fortress city, but the walls of Sedan offered little comfort against the growing shadow of defeat. The city of Sedan itself was a strategic stronghold, a symbol of France's military might in the region. Its walls were thick and its defenses strong, designed to withstand siege and delay enemy advances. But the fortress was a double-edged sword. While it promised protection, it also risked becoming a prison for the very troops seeking refuge within. The Prussians, advancing with relentless determination, were closing the noose. Every passing hour brought the threat of encirclement, cutting off any chance of escape or resupply. For the soldiers, the journey to Sedan was marked by a mix of grim determination and quiet despair. Letters from the front reveal the faces behind the uniforms. Men missing family, torn by fear, clinging to memories of home. Some spoke of camaraderie, the bonds forged in hardship. Others whispered of hopelessness, the weight of a war slipping beyond control. Officers tried to steady their men, issuing orders with firm voices that betrayed their own doubts. The march was a test not just of strength, but of spirit. Amid the trudging columns and dusty roads, stories emerged of heroism and heartbreak. A young lieutenant, wounded but refusing to leave his post, inspired his men with quiet courage. An elderly farmer, watching the passing soldiers, offered food and shelter despite his own hardships. But the overall picture was one of desperation, soldiers hungry for victory, yet facing the relentless advance of a better-prepared enemy. As the French troops approached Sedan, the city's walls loomed large, a beacon of hope turned ominous. The looming siege promised a final confrontation that would decide not only the fate of those trapped inside, but the future of France itself. Could the defenders hold fast? Or would the fortress become a tomb, sealing the end of a proud nation's resistance? The road to Sedan was more than a physical journey. It was a passage into history's unforgiving pages, where courage, failure, and fate intertwined. The answer lay ahead, hidden behind the fortress gates and the storm of battle to come. Chapter 14. The Battle of Mars-la-Tour. The sky above the rolling hills near Mars-la-Tour was thick with smoke and thunder. Cannons roared, guns cracked, and cries pierced the chaos. A brutal storm of steel and flesh. It was August 16, 1870, and the battlefield was a crucible of desperate men fighting for survival in a clash that would shape the fate of armies and nations. The Battle of Mars-la-Tour was fierce, savage, and ultimately indecisive, but its consequences rippled far beyond the bloodied fields. In the brutal struggle, the French army of the Rhine found itself isolated, cut off, vulnerable, and trapped in a web woven by Prussian strategy. The battle began with a collision of massive forces, each side determined to break the other's will. French soldiers, weary from retreat and determined to regroup, took up defensive positions along the ridges and forests. Their faces were marked by exhaustion and resolve. Men who knew the stakes were immense, but clung to hope amid growing fear. Across the field, Prussian troops advanced with cold precision, fueled by confidence in their commanders and technology. The clash was sudden, violent, and relentless, with neither side willing to yield ground. Amid the thunderous volleys, individual acts of heroism and tragedy unfolded. A captain led his men through a hail of bullets, rallying cries cutting through the smoke. A young artilleryman, hands trembling but steady, loaded cannon after cannon, the roar shaking his very soul. Yet, for every moment of courage, there were others of despair, soldiers lost in the chaos, wounded and left behind, faces etched with pain. The battlefield was a cruel theater, where the cost of each step forward was paid in blood. The term indecisive might suggest a stalemate, but the truth was more complex. Though neither side gained a clear victory that day, the battle's strategic outcome was profound. The Prussian forces succeeded in cutting off the French army of the Rhine from potential reinforcements and supplies. This isolation was a deadly blow, effectively trapping a large French force in a precarious position near Sedan. The battle was not just about territory. It was about control, encirclement, and the slow strangling of an enemy's ability to fight back. For the French commanders, Mars-la-Tour was a harsh lesson in the limits of valor against overwhelming organization. Despite fierce resistance, they could not break the Prussian grip. The soldiers, exhausted and outnumbered, faced the grim reality that their lines were shrinking, their options narrowing. Hope turned into a desperate calculation: hold the ground, or risk total annihilation. The weight of command bore heavily on officers, whose decisions could mean life or death for thousands. The Prussians, meanwhile, moved with the confidence of a force that understood its advantage. Their coordination, communication, and use of terrain reflected the years of reform and preparation that had shaped them. They tightened the noose around the French positions, setting the stage for a siege that would test endurance and resolve beyond the battlefield. Each cannonball fired was a step closer to victory, each order given a thread in the web trapping their foes. As night fell over the bloodied fields, the soldiers on both sides faced a chilling question. What came next? The battle had not delivered a decisive winner, but it had changed the game. The French army of the Rhine was caught, its fate tied to the looming fortress of Sedan. The coming days promised even greater trials, a siege that would push men beyond limits of endurance and test the very soul of a nation at war. The Battle of Mars-la-Tour stands as a haunting reminder of war's cruel calculus, where bravery meets strategy, and where a single day of fighting can alter the course of history. It was a brutal prelude to the storm that would engulf France, and a testament to the human cost of a conflict that shaped a continent. Chapter 15. The Trap Closes, Battle of Grave-Latte. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of gunpowder. The ground beneath was churned to mud and blood. It was August 18th, 1870, and the fields near Grave-Latte, close to the fortress city of Metz, became the stage for one of the bloodiest battles of the Franco-Prussian War. Tens of thousands of soldiers fought in a relentless, brutal contest where every inch of ground was paid for with staggering sacrifice. For the French forces trapped near Metz, hope was slipping away, the noose was tightening, and the trap was closing with terrifying finality. The battle began before dawn, under a sky heavy with ominous clouds. French troops, desperate and outnumbered, dug in along ridges and forests, trying to hold a line against the advancing Prussians. The French army was a patchwork of veteran soldiers, fresh recruits, and reservists, many exhausted from weeks of retreat and hard fighting. Their faces were etched with grim determination, but also with fear and exhaustion. They knew the stakes. Failure meant being surrounded, cut off from reinforcements and supplies, and potentially annihilated. The Prussians attacked with overwhelming numbers and coordination. Years of military reform had honed their ability to mass forces swiftly and strike with precision. Their artillery thundered relentlessly, shells exploding in deadly showers that tore apart trenches and shattered trees. Infantry advanced in disciplined waves, their rifles spitting fire as they pushed forward. The German commanders orchestrated the assault with cold efficiency, determined to squeeze the French forces into a tight corner near Metz and crush them before they could escape. For the French soldiers, the battle was a harrowing nightmare. Amid the thunder of cannon and crack of rifles, men struggled to hold their ground. Officers shouted orders over the din, trying to rally weary troops, but the chaos made coordination nearly impossible. Units became separated, communication broke down, and confusion spread like wildfire. Some soldiers fought with desperate courage, charging into enemy lines to buy time for their comrades. Others were caught in withering fire, falling in silence or screaming in agony. The battlefield was a brutal, chaotic storm where human endurance was pushed to its limits. The fortress city of Metz itself loomed in the distance, a looming symbol of French resistance and strategic importance. The defenders hoped the city's walls would provide refuge, but as the battle raged, it became clear that Metz was quickly becoming a cage. The Prussian forces were closing in on all sides, cutting off supply lines and escape routes. The French were trapped between the relentless assault and the city's fortifications, caught in a deadly vice. The scale of the battle was staggering. Over 100,000 soldiers on both sides fought over fields just a few miles across. Casualties mounted rapidly. Thousands were killed or wounded, the cries of the fallen mingling with the roar of battle. Medics and stretcher-bearers moved desperately through the carnage, trying to save lives amid the chaos. The human cost was immense, a testament to the terrible price paid for every scrap of ground. The commanders faced agonizing decisions. The French generals struggled to maintain a coherent defense, their forces stretched thin and morale sinking. Some advocated for a breakout attempt, a risky gamble to escape the tightening Prussian grip. Others urged holding the line, hoping reinforcements might arrive. The tension was unbearable, each choice weighed against the backdrop of imminent destruction. On the Prussian side, the commanders pushed their troops relentlessly. The victory at Gravelotte would seal the fate of the French army near Metz and shift the balance of the war decisively. Yet even as they pressed forward, they recognized the cost. The battlefield was strewn with the bodies of comrades and foes alike, a grim reminder that every gain was bought with sacrifice. The resolve of the soldiers was tested, but their discipline and coordination held firm. As night fell over Gravelotte, the battlefield was silent but not at peace. Fires burned in the distance, and the wounded moaned in the darkness. The French forces were battered, surrounded, and exhausted. The trap had closed, and the coming days promised grim consequences. The fortress of Metz was now a prison, and the fate of thousands hung in the balance. The Battle of Gravelotte was more than a fight for territory. It was a brutal contest of wills, between survival and destruction, hope and despair. For France, it marked the beginning of a desperate siege that would test the limits of endurance. For Prussia, it was a step closer to unification and domination. The war was far from over, but the blood-soaked fields of Gravelotte would forever stand as a symbol of sacrifice and the merciless calculus of battle. Chapter 16. The Fall of Napoleon III, Battle of Sedan. A cold morning fog blanketed the hills around Sedan. Somewhere in that haze, behind broken trees and shattered farmhouses, the future of France was unraveling. September 2nd, 1870. A battlefield strewn with bodies. Smoke rising in soft, white columns. And in the heart of it all, a man wrapped in an emperor's uniform, his metals dulled by soot and dust, staring into the empty silence of defeat. That man was Napoleon III, and on this day, he would cease to be emperor. But rewind just 24 hours, and things still seemed salvageable. Not hopeful, but not yet doomed. The French army, bloodied and tired from weeks of retreat, had taken position near the fortress town of Sedan in northeastern France. They were trapped in a loop of poor decisions and bad luck, circled by hills, forests, and rivers, with their backs to the Belgian border. Some officers spoke of holding the line. Others quietly questioned how long they could last. The enemy was closing in fast. The Prussians and their German allies had been marching in coordinated columns, like the teeth of a gear slowly clamping shut. They had mastered the science of war with chilling precision. Where the French relied on outdated command chains and Napoleon III's wavering leadership, the Prussians moved like a single organism, fast, efficient, and ruthless. They were led by generals who understood timing, geography, and momentum, and they had been stalking the French like wolves. By September 1st, the jaws of that machine had snapped shut. The morning began with cannon fire. 1,000 guns opened from the surrounding hills, raining steel from every direction. It was like thunder that never stopped. The French positions, crammed into narrow valleys and low ridges, were exposed. Soldiers scrambled for cover, clutching rifles and praying. Some tried to return fire, but the enemy artillery had the high ground. They could see everything. The French lines crumbled under the pressure. By mid-morning, chaos was everywhere. The French cavalry, still holding onto the traditions of glory from earlier wars, attempted a bold charge to break through. The chasseurs d'Afrique, proud, fearless, brightly uniformed, galloped into a storm of bullets and shells. Within minutes, they were mowed down. Horses screamed. Men fell. It was not a battle anymore. It was a slaughter. Napoleon III watched from a hilltop as the world he built collapsed in front of him. He was not the same kind of emperor his uncle had been. Where Napoleon Bonaparte had led charges and inspired men with fire in his voice, Napoleon III was quieter, more political, more fragile. His health had been deteriorating for months. He was in pain. He could barely sit in the saddle. His army no longer trusted him. His ministers no longer believed in him. But he had come to the front, to Sedan, perhaps seeking one last chance to restore his dignity. Instead, he watched his army fall apart. The Prussians closed in with surgical speed. Infantry swarmed from the woods. Artillery kept hammering from the hills. And then, they brought in the Krupp guns, massive steel cannons that fired with deadly accuracy. Compared to the French bronze artillery, the Krupp guns were like sniper rifles versus muskets. Every blast sent shockwaves through the air, punching holes in walls, carriages, and bodies alike. The French had no answer. Soon, entire French divisions were being encircled. Their lines were split. Commanders couldn't communicate. Some tried to organize last stands, fighting from ruined villages or along riverbanks. But the weight of firepower and the speed of the German advance was too much. Battalion after battalion fell back or surrendered. By late afternoon, French General McMahon, already wounded from shrapnel, was out of action. Leadership passed in confusion from one general to the next. There was no single plan, only isolated units, making desperate decisions in pockets of violence scattered across the map. Napoleon III had only one option left, to surrender. But even that was chaos. As the sun set over the ruins of Sedan, fires lit the horizon, and the sky turned orange with smoke and ash. French soldiers, wounded and hungry, sat silently on the ground. Some cried. Some stared at nothing. Thousands of them, stunned, beaten, humiliated. For them, the war was over. Napoleon III sent word to the Prussian king, Wilhelm I, asking for a ceasefire. And in the early hours of September 2nd, he did what no French monarch had done in centuries. He surrendered himself to the enemy. He rode out under a white flag. It was not a grand, ceremonial moment. There were no speeches. Just a broken man in an emperor's uniform, dismounting from his horse and handing over his sword. The meeting between Napoleon III and Wilhelm I was quiet and awkward. They were not equals. One man was victorious, standing tall beside his brilliant general, Otto von Bismarck. The other was a prisoner, dignified in posture, but hollow in spirit. Napoleon III did not plead. He did not argue. He simply asked that his men be treated with humanity. That was the end of the Second French Empire. News of the defeat at Sedan spread like wildfire across France. When the public learned that their emperor had surrendered, that over 80,000 soldiers had been captured in a single day, outrage exploded. Paris erupted. Crowds stormed the Legislative Assembly. Politicians resigned. The imperial palace was abandoned. On September 4th, just 2 days after Sedan, the French Empire officially collapsed. The Third Republic was declared in the heart of Paris. Napoleon III, now a captive of Prussia, was finished. He would spend the rest of his life in exile in England, quietly watching the world move on without him. But France had not yet surrendered. While the emperor had fallen, the war still burned. The new French Republic, raw, leaderless, and reeling from disaster, refused to give in. Citizens took up arms. Volunteers poured into the capital. The government relocated to Tours and then Bordeaux. And from the ashes of Sedan, a strange new chapter was just beginning. Because Bismarck, the iron architect of German unification, had not yet achieved his ultimate goal. He had defeated the emperor, but he wanted more. He wanted Paris. He wanted France to kneel. And above all, he wanted to declare a German empire, forged in blood and glory, in the heart of Europe. But the French people were not done fighting. The war would now shift into something darker, more desperate. A people's war, a siege, a winter of hunger and rebellion. The fall of Sedan was not the end. It was the beginning of a new, more painful struggle. The trap had closed. The emperor was gone. But the soul of France still burned with fury. And now, all eyes turned to Paris. Chapter 17. The End of the Second Empire. The moment came like a thunderclap, thousands captured in one crushing blow. The emperor, once a symbol of French pride, now a prisoner. On a single day at Sedan, the Second Empire collapsed. The man who had ruled France for nearly 2 decades, Napoleon III, surrendered himself under the weight of defeat. And with him, The era of imperial pomp and stability vanished instantly into the smoky haze of war. In the hours after the surrender, Paris felt like a body betrayed. News of the emperor's capture spread across the city like wildfire, spoken in hushed whispers at markets, screamed in protests outside assembly halls, and printed in bold headlines the very next morning. Napoleon has fallen. Our emperor is captive. The words rattled through cafes and boulevards, turning pride into panic. Families trembled, politicians scrambled, and citizens each felt personally betrayed by a fate they had not chosen. Within 2 days, the political heart of France tore itself apart. On September 4, 1870, a new government declared itself from the wreckage of imperial authority. In trembling voices filled with urgency, delegates stood in the National Assembly and proclaimed the Third Republic, France without an emperor. There was no grand ceremony, only determination born of despair. The empire's grandeur evaporated, replaced by a republic that seemed both fragile and necessary. The provisional government sprang into life amid flames and fear. The Tuileries and other imperial palaces were abandoned. Rioters stormed state buildings. Power shifted within hours. Ordinary citizens, workers, students, and small office clerks found themselves thrust into politics. They filled council seats, volunteered in militias, and demanded action. Paris was now governed not by courtiers in silk, but by citizens in lamppost-lit streets, carrying posters and chanting for justice. And yet, while hope flickered in the hearts of some, despair burned in the faces of many. The war was not over. The French army lay shattered, the emperor gone, and Prussian forces loomed ever closer to the gates of Paris. The Third Republic was born in urgency, but without real authority or resources. The new leaders had no army, no treasury, and little time. Instead, they had only fury, fear, and a fervent will to resist. Throughout the city, every man, woman, and child felt the weight of loss. Mothers mourned sons already dead. Children worried if their fathers would ever return. Workers stopped at factories to hear updates on troop movements. Soldiers drifting back from the front found their uniforms torn and spirits broken, but they refused to let defeat define them. They joined resistance units. They enlisted in volunteer corps. The streets, once lit by candlelight and laughter, now echoed with the heavy tread of anxious feet. For Bismarck and the Prussians, the fall of the emperor was a triumph. They had achieved what diplomacy and force had aimed for. France without its leader, ready to submit. Yet even in victory, they hesitated. The provisional government declared Paris open to negotiations, but the city's spirit remained defiant. The red flags of revolution mixed with tricolor banners of resistance. A siege was inevitable. Prussia now faced not just a defeated army, but a rebellious republic. Inside the new government, leaders argued over the future, how to feed the hungry, organize defenses, and negotiate peace. Letters poured in from the provinces urging unity. Volunteer battalions formed in parks and squares. Yet planning was chaotic. Poverty and disease rippled through neighborhoods. Full mobilization proved impossible. The city writhed with contradictions, despair and defiance, fatigue and resolve. Every night, the silhouette of Paris burned under street lamps and bonfires, as citizens burned imperial symbols, shredded flags, and rewrote posters of hope. In handwritten notes hidden in frozen winters, Parisians promised each other, "We will endure, we will fight." And though the Republic was new, its purpose was old, survival. But even as new leaders spoke of resistance and honor, Paris lay surrounded. Prussian cannons could soon reach the heart of the city. The provisional government knew the cost of delay: starvation, bombardment, collapse. Every decision carried weight beyond politics. It would determine life or death. The end of the Second Empire marked not just a political shift, but the birth of a nation redefined under fire. The Third Republic rode into existence on anger and desperation. Its leaders had no guarantee of survival, only the promise of struggle. As Paris gathered its wounded, fed its hungry, and armed its citizens, one question loomed in every shadowed street. Could this fragile new republic hold when the enemy stood at the gates? The answer lay ahead, in a siege that would stretch the limits of endurance and test the soul of a nation forged in the flames of defeat. Chapter 18. The Siege of Metz. A single day in late October of 1870 sealed the fate of tens of thousands behind steel walls. The French garrison of Metz, a once formidable fortress, surrendered. In one sweeping, silent act, the hopes of national relief vanished. Starvation, betrayal, despair, and the shock rippled through France like an earthquake. The siege began months earlier. Marshal François-Achille Bazaine, a respected commander, had led the French army of the Rhine into Metz, seeking strength in its storied fortifications. But the city quickly became a cage. Prussian forces encircled it with chilling precision, their artillery high on surrounding hills, their lines utterly unbroken. No messages in or out. No reinforcements. No escape. Inside Metz, conditions deteriorated fast. Supplies dwindled. Bread rations shrank. Hunger gnawed at stomachs. Disease crept through crowded barracks. Soldiers and civilians huddled together in freezing nights, trading memories of home for crumbs of hope. Letters smuggled out described weeks of cold, starvation, and whispered panic. Yet Bazaine resisted surrender longer than many expected. The defenders tried to appear strong, but morale slipped. Junior officers spoke in grim whispers about resignations and defeat. Soldiers looked to Marshal Bazaine, his uniform once bright, now dull with grime. Reports reached him of mutinous grumbling, rumors of betrayal, that some in the French high command preferred to see Metz fall than risk rebuilding the army elsewhere. That relief forces were misled, delayed on purpose. For Bazaine, surrender was unbearably personal. He had fought battles, led columns, endured hardship. He had watched his soldiers die. Yet the walls closed ever tighter. On the morning of October 27th, he sent a white flag over the fort's main gate. The act shattered illusions. In one gesture, the Army of the Rhine, also known as the Army of Metz, became prisoners. Over 140,000 French soldiers marched out as captives. The shock was immediate. In Paris, the news landed like a bomb. Citizens in rallies stared in disbelief. "Our army gone," they whispered. Newspapers that once cried slogans of resistance now printed grief and anger. Letters from home came from soldiers who expected to march again, only to find themselves behind Prussian lines. Families tore their hair in despair, unsure of what remained of national honor. Bazaine became a symbol, one of disgrace and retreat. Critics called him traitor, coward, betrayer. Supporters whispered that no one alive could have held Metz longer under those conditions. The debate raged. Was this military necessity or national humiliation? Either way, the fall of Metz underlined that France's war was unraveling on every front. For the Prussians, the victory at Metz was more than a successful siege. It removed the largest French field army in one stroke. Logistics became easier. Commanders could turn more troops toward the approaching capital. The path to Paris lay clearer than ever. Inside the fortress, families tried to cope. A mother wrote in smeared ink about her son's last letter saying, "Wait for me." But she never would. Soldiers sang bitter songs as they marched into captivity. Officers, shackled in irons, stared at blank fields that once seemed defensible. France's new republic reeled. The hope for relief from Metz vanished. Resources had been gambled on Bazaine's army to break through, but it failed. Despair spread among commanders. The provisional government, struggling to maintain order, now faced the prospect of defending Paris with nothing but volunteer battalions and dwindling supplies. Yet in the rubble of surrender, some fire remained. Civilians and soldiers alike vowed not to repeat the defeat. Resistance groups formed. Pamphlets circulated calling for defiance. Though Metz lay in enemy hands, Paris still refused to bow. Now, with France's second-largest army gone, and Metz surrendered, the stage was grim. The war would move closer to home. The capital itself would soon face encirclement and starvation. Mustering hope from ashes, France prepared to endure its darkest winter. The surrender at Metz was not the war's end. It was its most bitter turning point, and the next act would bring destiny knocking at Paris's gates. Chapter 19. The Siege of Paris begins. The moment arrived like a verdict, guns thundering, lines of smoke encircling the city. Paris, once the heart of Europe, was now trapped under iron. Prussian armies had closed in, cutting off all escape. The capital stood alone, its fate sealed by steel and strategy. Early September 1870. The Prussian lines stretched around Paris like a tightening noose. Citizens peered through windows at soldiers digging trenches in the suburbs. Across the city, newsboys cried headlines of encirclement. Some wrote, "The city is surrounded," in large letters. Others, "Hope fades." The reality was overwhelming. The war had come home. Inside Paris, panic and resolve mingled in every heart. Mothers clutched children. Lovers held each other close. Shopkeepers shuttered windows not to keep out burglars, but to fortify against shells. Volunteers formed ad hoc battalions in city squares, men from every walk of life wearing borrowed uniforms, rifles shaking in unsteady hands. They vowed to defend the city, though many had never fired a shot in anger. The streets shifted from cafes to council rooms. The new republic scrambled to organize defenses. Men with little training were placed behind hastily built barricades. Citizens cleared rubble to erect roadblocks. Every man and woman contributed. Hospitals filled with wounded, the injured carried in handcarts or carried on shoulders. Aid workers, overwhelmed, moved with urgency, their voices calm masks over pounding hearts. Food became a daily worry, supplies dwindled, prices rose, and queues at bakeries stretched for blocks. In the shadow of iconic landmarks, civilians sensed the weight of history pressing on them. The Eiffel Tower was still years from completion, but the Arc de Triomphe and Notre Dame stood silent. From battlements and rooftops, defenders watched as the Prussian flag crept nearer. Communication lines, severed by encirclement, turned neighborhoods into islands. Rumors spread of incoming assaults, of possible breaches. Yet within each small district, ordinary people waited, prepared to fight if needed. The Prussians, prepared for a siege rather than a direct assault, relied on artillery and patience. Their long-range cannons were set on surrounding hills. Day after day, shells splashed against walls, lit fires, shattered windows. Each explosion carried news. The enemy was not bluffing. Armored trains and infantry units patrolled circles miles out, cutting roads, severing supply lines, preventing any French attempt at relief. The city's map had become a maze, with exits sealed and hearts trembling. Inside, the psychological battle raged. Newspapers that once declared bravado now reported rationing, civilian committees, and pleas for calm. Public morale became a front of its own. Clubs organized distributions of soup. Bakeries dispensed bread by weight. Posters declared liberty through resistance. Yet in private homes, voices trembled over the threat of starvation. Children asked if they would ever go to school again. Parents forced uncertain smiles and hope on sick faces. Even the defenders learned that drab uniforms did not equate to readiness. Many recruits had no training. Some rifles jammed. Officers improvised tactics, using city alleys as defense lines or converting parks into supply dumps. But the enemy was methodical. Prussian engineers dug tunnels, laid telegraphs, planned slow entry points to weaken defenses. Paris was resisting, but the machinery closed inexorably. Every day, the horizon brought new anxiety. Smoke from fires haunted the skyline. Tension crackled in the cold air. Rumors of internal dissent circulated. Some feared betrayal from collaborators. Others whispered of desperate generals advocating surrender. Yet silence reigned in public offices. Speeches grew somber, and once optimistic crowds hardened into silent watchers. And still the shells came. They shattered rooftops at dawn. They collapsed walls at midnight. They ended lives without warning. Parisians counted the times their neighbors became casualties. Each explosion scarred the city's soul. Yet resistance continued. Each time the Prussians advanced, defenders rushed into fallen streets, patching barricades, nursing the wounded, urging each other forward. For the government, these were dire days. Leaders met in dim rooms beneath city halls. Strategies were debated, ration plans drawn, volunteer brigades organized. There was no army left to command, only the will of citizens and the resolve of a fledgling republic. Every order weighed heavy. Decisions meant lives, and there was no margin for error. The siege had begun not just as a military operation, but as a contest for the spirit of Paris. Would the world's cultural capital stand tall under bombardment, or would fear, hunger, defeat its people before the guns? Unseen in the trenches, unseen in the smoky streets, the next chapter of the war was being written, not by generals, but by civilians. And as night fell over the candlelit alleys, one question echoed in every silent room. How long could hope hold out when Paris itself was under siege? Chapter 20. Balloons over Paris. The sky above Paris that winter was filled with something strange, gleaming against the gray horizon, the faint, billowing arcs of hot air balloons drifting beyond the city walls. From below, residents looked upward with mingled dread and wonder. The Prussian siege had turned Paris into a fortress under clouded skies, its borders sealed, its people trapped. And yet, above the rooftops, those balloons carried hope. Messages, news, pleas, and plans. Rising, escaping, never to return. This was the city's desperate ingenuity, its silent rebellion. Balloons over Paris. Down below, the capital was suffocating under starvation and fear. Communication lines were cut. Telegraph wires lay severed. The outside world seemed unreachable. Inside the encircled city, rumors spread faster than facts. Food was scarce, newspapers dwindled, and official proclamations offered only half-truths. Silence had descended. Into that silence floated balloon pilots, brave, determined souls risking everything to break the blockade. The process was extraordinary. Filling large silk or rubber balloons with hydrogen, a dangerous gas made from iron filings and acid. Crews laboriously inflated them on rooftops and wide fields, in bitter cold and under the watch of nervous crowds. Each balloon carried a wicker basket, cramped, freezing, and rattling with equipment and ballast sacks. Inside, a pilot and messenger huddled, clutching sealing wax or glue for pigeon vans, letters tied with strings, and small packages with vital information. When the balloon lifted off, it was alone in the wind, rising through the gloom, carrying a city's last ties to the world. The pilots were heroes of endurance. Some said they looked calm as they ascended. Others recalled that they trembled like men at their own deaths. They carried messages from the government in Paris to the armies outside, requesting relief or reporting conditions inside the capital. They also evacuated patients, civilians, and wounded soldiers, small loads strapped to harnesses, floating across enemy lines with fragile hope. There was no sure return. Many landed far beyond reach, crash landing, stranded, but they had escaped with lives and stories. Alongside balloons, Paris used carrier pigeons, the old, humble birds that delivered messages strapped onto their legs. When balloons weren't feasible, pigeon posts became lifelines. Military commanders attached short notes written in tiny handwriting onto pigeons and released them from balconies or courtyards. Some soared high into the freezing sky, flying past trooping infantry and artillery posts to reach generals in the field or committees in the provinces. Citizens watched them go, hearts aching. When a pigeon returned with a note, a scrap of news from home, it was greeted like a miracle. Behind these efforts were ordinary men and women caught in extraordinary roles. Balloon operators were engineers or postal clerks thrust into aeronautics. Pigeon handlers were hairdressers, secretaries, or bakers who had learned to care for a fragile bird. They became operators of civilian war machines, their everyday skills transformed overnight by necessity. Many worked by candlelight in hidden workshops, forging pigeon capsules, sealing balloons, or organizing secret flights, all under the threat of Prussian raids or artillery bombardment. The psychological weight of this work was immense. Every balloon launch was a gamble. Pupils from the École Polytechnique whispered prayers as they filled hydrogen tanks. Nurses watched tearfully as wounded men were strapped into gondolas, each ascent a farewell and a risk. Families waited on rooftops, hoping to glimpse the floating vessel one last time, or to see it form a pinpoint in the distance that meant they still mattered. Balloons and pigeons also carried propaganda and morale. Newspapers printed transcripts of letters from the front, stories of victory or bravery, to remind Parisians that the war was not forgotten outside. Poems, prayers, and patriotic slogans were written on scraps and tied to pigeons. The messages fluttered across enemy lines, reaching French troops or international observers, challenging the narrative of crushing defeat. Some balloons dropped leaflets over German lines, urging soldiers to recall shared European history, to remember women and children starving in the city they besieged. These symbolic gestures were futile in military terms, yet powerful in human terms. They were messages from Paris as France itself dared defiance through the air. The technology was imperfect. Balloons drifted off course in shifting winds, landing days later in German territory or lost into forests. Captured pilots might reveal secret dispatches under pressure, endangering lives and plans. Pigeons were shot down, eaten by predators, or simply lost in the chaos of war. Still, the system persisted, relentlessly improvised, rebuilt after failure, born of stubborn refusal to be silenced. For many Parisians, the sight of a balloon rising at dawn was more than a machine. It was a symbol of resistance. A housewife tending her infant saw it slip over rooftops and felt her fear ease for a moment. A shopkeeper paused as it passed, slowing his steps to watch its silhouette fade. Children rushed to rooftops, pointing and shouting with wild awe. It was a small victory in desperate times, a moment when the city felt alive, connected, and defiant. But each success came with fear, too. Rumors circulated of German sharpshooters targeting balloons, of sabotage by collaborators, of hydrogen leaks that exploded at launch, killing crews. One pilot's diary, smuggled out via pigeon, spoke of being caught in wires, dragged from the air, and forced to burn his dispatch letters. Another wrote of floating for hours over enemy positions before crash landing in a swamp, walking home on foot for days. Their stories were painful and breathtaking. As winter deepened and the siege grew harsher, the need for these flights became greater. Food supplies dwindled to animal feed and sawdust, bread rations were slashed, and sickness grew. The government, desperate for outside aid or negotiation, relied on balloon messages to keep channels open. Relief offers came from abroad, medical personnel, diplomatic envoys, but they depended on secure communication lines. Without the balloons and pigeons, Paris would have been cut off as completely as an island in a frozen sea. By January, the flights slowed, not for lack of need, but because hydrogen gas grew difficult to make in freezing temperatures. Pigeons grew weak from cold, operators collapsed from exhaustion. Yet the flights resumed again, by sheer will, by desperation, by need. They became acts of defiance. Paris refused to whisper. It would shout, even from the air. And as one balloon disappeared into a snow-gray sky carrying wounded children and farewell letters, those left behind on rooftops felt both terror and pride. They knew the pilot might not return. They felt the risk in their bones. But they also felt connection to families beyond the walls, to soldiers still fighting, to a world that had not forgotten them. Each flash of flame heating the gas balloon's burner was a small rebellion. Each pigeon's flap a message of enduring hope. The chapter of Balloons over Paris is a story of humanity rising amid despair, innovation born of crisis, courage that doesn't wait for permission, and communication that surpasses siege. But even as balloons lifted and pigeons flew, the war pressed on. The next chapter would bring greater trials, starvation, bombardment, and an autumn that tested the limits of endurance. Chapter 21. France fights on, the government of national defense. The smoke of Paris still hung heavy in the air when the scream of artillery paused, only for a breath. And in that moment of stillness, a whisper ran through the city like wind through broken glass. The emperor is gone. But freedom brought no relief. Instead, a new terror took its place. France, battered, leaderless, surrounded, now faced the impossible. With its capital under siege, it had no emperor, no seasoned army, and yet it would fight on. It had to. In the early days of September 1870, as Paris watched the fires burn from afar, the embers of Sedan still hot, the shame of defeat still raw, a new government was proclaimed. It was not born from stability or strength, but from chaos and desperation. The government of national defense, a name grander than its strength, rose from the ashes of Napoleon III's fall. In theory, it was a republic. In practice, it was a committee of frightened men huddled in dim rooms, arguing as the walls closed in. General Trochu, a devout Catholic and an old-school soldier, took command. He had once penned essays on military theory. Now, he was trapped in the capital, commander of a starving garrison and a city full of frightened civilians. Jules Favre, the voice of diplomacy, tried to keep a steady tone in his speeches, but his lips trembled. Léon Gambetta, young, sharp, with eyes like flint, believed that France still had fight left in her bones. But could belief alone stop an army? The Prussians didn't wait. They encircled Paris with chilling precision. Like tightening a noose, their siege lines wrapped around the city, cutting off food, fuel, letters, hope. Within days, railways were gone. Telegraph lines were cut. Newspapers shrank in size as paper ran out, and rumors took their place. There was no way in or out, not by road, not by wire, not by rail. And so, the city improvised. While horses pulled cannons, others were eaten. While gas lamps flickered, oil ran low. And while the government scrambled, a new question spread in the alleys and cafes. Can we still resist? The people of Paris, tired and trembling, wanted to believe the answer was yes. The government needed it to be. Outside the capital, things were even worse. France, the old France, proud France, found itself scraping together armies from scratch. There were no legions of trained soldiers left. Most had been captured or killed in the early defeats. So, the government of national defense began calling upon boys barely old enough to shave and old men with shaking hands and aching knees. They wore mismatched uniforms. Their rifles jammed. Some had never even fired a shot before being marched to the front. And yet, they came. From Bordeaux to Tours, from Lyon to Rouen, raw recruits answered the call. They drilled in frozen fields and muddy barns. They sang old songs to warm their spirits. Some believed in the Republic. Others simply wanted to protect their homes. Many knew, deep down, that they were marching toward death, and still, they marched. Gambetta, fiery and determined, escaped Paris in a hot air balloon, a mad, desperate act to organize resistance in the provinces. As the balloon soared through the clouds, Prussian bullets pierced the sky, but he made it out. And once he touched ground, he became a man possessed, riding by horseback, sleeping in barns, addressing crowds in villages. Gambetta poured every ounce of fire he had into France's wounded veins. He raised new armies. He demanded sacrifice. He believed, truly, fiercely, that France could still win. But belief wasn't enough. The new armies, the armes de la Loire, du Nord, and de l'Est, were brave, yes. But they were also chaotic. Poorly armed, poorly fed, poorly led. Officers clashed over strategy. Supplies vanished into muddy roads. And wherever these new forces clashed with the seasoned Prussian troops, the outcome was grim. At Coulmiers, there was a spark. French forces actually won. The Prussians fell back, and Paris briefly rejoiced. But it didn't last. At Beaune-la-Rolande, at Orleans, at Le Mans, hope turned to horror. The Prussians, organized, calm, lethal, struck like iron. The French lines crumbled. Thousands were captured. Thousands more lay dead in the fields. Back in Paris, cold and hunger grew worse. People burned furniture for warmth. Bread lines stretched for blocks. The price of flour soared. Parisians began to eat rats, cats, even animals from the zoo. Not out of choice, out of desperation. The sound of cannon fire became part of daily life. Children flinched in their sleep. Mothers stared out windows, waiting for letters that would never come. The government, now trapped behind its own defenses, sent out declarations of defiance. But the people, they felt forgotten. And in that emptiness, fear returned. Some whispered that the Republic was too weak to win. Others dreamed of a king, or even the emperor's return. The city's political fabric began to tear at the seams. Anxieties bubbled in the clubs and cafes. The working class, bearing the worst of the siege, felt betrayed by the elites. Resentment festered. Then came the rumors of secret negotiations, of surrender talks. Jules Favre, once so eloquent, now trembled before Bismarck at Versailles, trying to find a way out. But Bismarck wanted humiliation, not peace, not compromise. He demanded Alsace. He demanded Lorraine. He demanded blood. And as Gambetta raged from the provinces and Trochu stalled in the capital, the people of Paris began to turn inward. Some prayed. Others plotted. By early January, the siege had lasted for over 3 months. The government had tried to break out of the city, twice. Both times, French forces had been repelled with heavy losses. The River Seine froze. Food stores ran dry. And as the new year dawned, it brought with it a single question. How much longer can we hold on? Gambetta begged the provinces for one more push. One more offensive. One more miracle. The Army of the East, under General Bourbaki, was sent toward Belfort, trying to outflank the Prussians. But nature itself turned against them. Snow buried the roads. Temperatures dropped. Soldiers marched with frozen toes and empty bellies. When Bourbaki's offensive collapsed, thousands of French troops staggered toward the Swiss border, beaten, starving, frostbitten, and surrendered themselves for internment. Back in Paris, there was nothing left to try. Trochu, once the capital's defender, handed over power. Favre, desperate, agreed to meet Bismarck again. And this time, there were no speeches, no declarations, just silence and signatures. An armistice was signed on January 28, 1871. Paris would be allowed to live, but it would do so in shame. The Prussians entered the city, not all of it, but just enough to leave a scar. German boots echoed down the Champs-Élysées. The people of Paris, too proud to shout, stood in silence. Some wept. Others turned their backs. A foreign flag flew over the Arc de Triomphe, briefly, but long enough. France's defeat was not just military. It was psychological. It was spiritual. The Second Empire had ended in disgrace. The republic that followed had crumbled under the weight of siege and sorrow. And yet, something stirred beneath the ruins. The war was not truly over. Not in the hearts of the people. Not in the streets of Paris. Because while the cannons now fell silent, another kind of battle, a civil one, was about to explode. As the government, now relocated to Bordeaux, tried to rebuild, and Prussian troops began to withdraw, Paris grew restless. Angry. Betrayed. It had survived the siege, endured the hunger, and now, after all that, it was to be surrendered? Left in the cold? Whispers turned to shouts. Meetings turned to riots. A spark was all it would take. And that spark was coming. Chapter 22. The Loire Campaign. Rain lashed the muddy roads of central France as soldiers, barely trained, barely fed, barely men, trudged through the freezing muck. The sound of boots slapping in sludge echoed like a grim metronome to the rhythm of a desperate republic at war. Somewhere near Orleans, on a wind-choked November morning, a boy no older than 16 clutched a rusting rifle, his fingers wrapped tight around cold metal, his face paler than the fog swallowing the Loire River. He had never fired a weapon in his life. Now, he was being asked to save a nation. This was not Napoleon's army. This was not the proud imperial force that had once terrified Europe. The old Second Empire had crumbled into dust after Sedan, and what rose in its place was a government built on panic and hope, a fragile scaffolding of lawyers, teachers, doctors, farmers, civilians turned soldiers by necessity. The French government of national defense, formed in the chaos after Napoleon III capture, had promised to resist, to reclaim, to redeem. But promises didn't stop bullets. After Paris fell under siege, the fight spilled outwards. France did not surrender. It scattered. The war wasn't over. It simply changed shape. While Prussian troops choked the capital from all sides, the heart of France beat on from the countryside. And from the south, down the fertile, fog-thick corridor of the Loire River, a desperate gamble began to take form. This was the Loire Campaign. At its center stood General Louis d'Aurelle de Paladins, a name now nearly forgotten, but once whispered across every table in Tours and Orleans. An experienced officer, aged and cautious, d'Aurelle had little faith in glory. What he had instead was the impossible task of shaping an army out of smoke. Recruits poured in, young and old, shoemakers and schoolteachers, ragged patriots from every shattered corner of France. By late October of 1870, nearly 100,000 troops had been scraped together under his command. On paper, they were an army. In reality, they were a question mark, an untested force stitched from panic, nationalism, and whatever uniforms could be scavenged from abandoned barracks and dead men's backs. But then, in an unexpected stroke of fortune, came Coulmiers. On November 9th, d'Aurelle's raw army met the Bavarian forces of General von der Tann near the small village of Coulmiers. And, in a moment that stunned both France and Prussia, the French won. It was not just a battle, it was a breath of life. The French used their superior numbers, the element of surprise, and sheer desperation to overwhelm the Bavarians, forcing them to retreat and leaving Orleans free. Church bells rang across the Republic. Newspapers declared a turning point. The myth of Prussian invincibility cracked, if only for a moment. But that moment was fragile, and the victory misleading. Behind the celebration, the truth was less triumphant. d'Aurelle hesitated to pursue the retreating Bavarians. He worried, rightly, that his army was too green to push further. Supplies were thin. Discipline was weak. Many of his men had never seen combat before Coulmiers. He held his line rather than advance, and that pause gave the enemy time to regroup. Bismarck and the Prussian High Command would not allow a single French victory to grow into a rebellion. And so, they responded with force. Reinforcements poured south. General Friedrich von Werder from Alsace. The redoubtable Prince Friedrich Karl from the east. They came with veteran troops, with artillery, with orders to crush this uprising before it spread like wildfire. The stage was set for a brutal winter campaign in the heart of France, one filled with snow, starvation, shattered hope, and rivers red with regret. By December, the hammer came down. At Beaune-la-Rolande, at Loigny, at Orleans, names now mostly forgotten outside textbooks, blood was spilled in waves. The French, still swelling with raw volunteers, tried to hold their ground, but their inexperience showed. Their lines broke. Their morale cracked. And despite desperate resistance and local bravery, by mid-December, Orleans was lost again. Imagine the heartbreak. The same city the French had liberated with such joy just weeks earlier now burned under Prussian boots. It was more than a military loss. It was psychological collapse. Soldiers wept in the streets. Civilians screamed at government officials, pleading for food, for leadership, for hope. The fragile pride of the government of national defense shattered like a frozen lake under cannon fire. Still, they fought on. Further west, another force, the Army of the West, attempted to relieve the pressure, pushing toward Le Mans. But this too ended in failure. And in the bitter cold of January 1871, the Prussian machine ground forward again. Everywhere it moved like a glacier, slow, implacable, and deadly. But what's often forgotten, buried beneath the grand strategies and battlefield maps, is the human toll. Children orphaned in a morning. Mothers watching sons pulled from fields and tossed into trenches. Letters sent by candlelight in makeshift barracks, stained by frozen fingers and quiet dread. One French soldier wrote, "We are not fighting the Germans. We are fighting fear, hunger, and the death of France." His words never reached home. The balloon carrying his letter was shot down before it cleared the front. And yet, amidst all this darkness, the Republic refused to die. Each failed campaign, each retreat, each loss of ground only deepened the resolve in some corners of France. Mayors rallied their towns. Priests turned chapels into hospitals. Children carried water to the front. The war had ceased to be about territory. It had become about identity. What does it mean to be French? To lose a crown, a capital, and still claim a country? By the time the Loire campaign fizzled to its tragic end in early January, the grand ambitions of the national defense had collapsed into muddy reality. The government relocated again. Paris was still under siege. The countryside groaned under winter. Prussian soldiers now occupied vast swathes of the French interior. But the fighting hadn't stopped. Even in retreat, even in loss, something had changed. The war was no longer just between two nations. It had become a battle over the soul of modern France. Would the people submit, like in 1815 after Waterloo? Or would they fight to their final breath, even when all seemed lost? The answer would come soon. Because, as Prussian troops pressed ever closer to Paris, and France's armies lay scattered and broken, whispers began to stir in the south, in the valleys and villages untouched by Prussian boots. Whispers of revolution, of vengeance, of something far more radical than a mere republic. And as snow fell silently on the ruins of Orleans, a new storm was brewing far from the front lines. One that would not wear uniforms or carry flags, but would change the fate of France forever. The empire had died. The republic was bleeding. And now, in the shadows of defeat, the commune was waiting. Chapter 23. The harsh winter of 1870–71. That moment came before dawn, when the cold attacked hardest, a city shivering in silence, with no bread, no heat, and no end in sight. Parisians awoke to frost-bitten windows and the echo of distant cannon fire. They understood then. This winter would not just freeze bones, but break spirits. Hunger had a voice now, and it whispered through every empty lantern, every gasping breath, every tear-stained cheek. Inside Paris, the siege had stretched into its fourth month, and the city was suffocating. Streets once alive with chatter and music were silent except for the crunch of ice underfoot, the distant drum of artillery, and the scramble of volunteer messengers. Shops had closed long ago. Homes were cold. Wood for fires vanished. Gaslights winked out one by one. Candles were rationed. The hunger was slow and cunning. It started in the belly and crept upward into the mind. Bread, the simple staff of life, became a memory or a legend. Rations dropped drastically, a few ounces a day, if you could wait in line for hours before morning raids started. Meat was banned. Milk for infants was nearly impossible to find. People scavenged, tree bark roasted into coarse flour, pedal tea ranked as a drink. Some cooked raccoon, rats, pigeons, even zoo animals. The famed Parisian café culture vanished. Café patrons now were ghosts. Starvation showed its face in the eyes of citizens. Thin mothers bundled children, shifting with every shiver. Soldiers, who had once marched with pride, huddled in their fraying coats, shaking in rows like failing hymns. Grocery clerks counted ration cards with trembling hands. Doctors wrote letters on scraps. Because of hunger, and because of cold, our muscles fail. We sneeze scaled skin. We carry pathogens stronger than bullets. Meanwhile, bombs rained stones on rooftops. Long-range Prussian artillery had taken positions on the hills surrounding Paris. Each shell was more than destruction. It was a message that the city was not just surrounded, but under unrelenting pressure. Windows shattered at midnight. Churches caught fire. Street lamps collapsed in smoky flashes. Some nights, shells carved flaming lines across the sky, reminding everyone that life was fragile and that death was patient. Families huddled in basements, hearing each explosion like a visitation. In hospitals, the wounded lay shivering on straw mattresses, half frozen, half fed, half forgotten. The staff, mostly volunteers, old nurses, young students, worked in cramped corridors. They washed frostbite into bandages, fed the starving, soothed despair. Some wrote in secret journals, "A child died in my arms at dawn." His mother lay beside him, more lifeless than her son. Children became pale shadows of childhood. Mothers hid their hunger to feed them. Fathers tried to cheer clinging toddlers with nursery rhymes, but voices cracked. Schools emptied. Stories turned grim. Even pets vanished. A stray cat became acceptance. Pigeons, once the messengers of fate, were now dinner. Hope felt ember faint, but still, people tried to fan it. At the government offices, behind barricaded windows, officials argued through fog breath. Trochu commanded new sorties to break the lines, but could only muster ragged volunteers. Gambetta's calls to provinces for relief grew fainter in the wind. Coordination fractured. Internal disputes, between radicals demanding resistance and moderates calling for negotiation, grew heated under candlelight. In meetings, voices cracked at mentions of surrender. Diplomacy felt like betrayal. News from outside was both lifeline and torment. Balloons still carried some letters, some medicine, but flights slowed under freezing hydrogen hoses and gunfire. Pigeons flew less often. Many dropped frozen midair. Press prints grew smaller. Headlines urging defiance looked hollow next to stories of orphans scavenging for coal. Letters intercepted across the lines carried promises of food convoys, but turned out to be empty. Yet, amid this winter of despair, small fires of humanity burned bright. Neighbors shared soup, even when suspicious of each other. Foreign doctors slipped into the city with medical kits, saved lives by candlelight. Street performers sang quietly under lantern light to raise spirits. Workers organized clandestine bakeries and cellar rooms, using raided grain stores. Children exchanged drawings. "Paris, we love you," etched in charcoal on tattered walls. One particularly cold night in late December, near Montmartre, a group of volunteers huddled around a small urn of soup. Flames in the pot danced as they shared slices of bread. A young woman, her cheeks sunken but her eyes clear, whispered, "We live so our children can remember a free Paris." Her words passed silently through the hush, resolve against despair. The Prussians, meanwhile, did not rest. Sentries patrolled closer, shells fired closer. Parisians knew the next weeks could bring an assault, or worse, siege starvation. Supply wagons outside were sent to intercept pillagers. Rumors circulated that the Prussians considered starving the city into submission. The cold was no longer just weather, it was weaponized. And with each tragic death from cold or hunger, the government's mandate weakened. Rumors of a secret armistice floated among cafes. Whispers that Trochu's negotiators were being pressured to surrender. Some radicals plotted revolts. Some moderates begged for peace. Shock turned to fractures. Fear turned to accusation. Still, the people, against all logic, held on. For every body frozen in a stairwell, another citizen lit a candle. For every rationed slice of bread, someone sang a song. For every shell that fell, a flag fluttered defiantly. Parisians had no army. They had no emperor. But they had each other. But the winter moved eastward, and the calendar approached January. No supply relief. No mass escape. Only the cold and the artillery, and the faint sound of hope cracking. Debates raged. Is resistance still possible? Or is surrender inevitable? The next chapter would answer, and would not spare the truth of what Paris endured. Chapter 24. The German Empire is born. The mirrors reflected something far more haunting than splendor. In the gilded hall of mirrors at Versailles, a place once crafted to showcase French glory and absolute monarchy, stood Wilhelm of Prussia, straight-backed, emotionless, his eyes fixed not on the past, but on the new world he was about to usher in. It was January 18th, year 1871. The cold air inside the palace matched the frost that still blanketed the siege-worn lands outside. Then came the words, proclaimed not in French, but in thunderous, clipped German, Kaiser Wilhelm der Erste, Wilhelm I, Emperor of Germany. The cheers that followed didn't come from Parisians. They echoed off the mirrored walls from the throats of German princes, officers, and nobles. Their voices rang out not just with pride, but with the cold, sharp finality of triumph. In that moment, France was not only defeated militarily, she was humiliated ceremonially, symbolically. The very heart of her royal legacy had become the cradle of a newborn empire. one forged in the smoke and fire of war. It was a bitter ceremony born out of fire, blood, and politics. A culmination of decades of German fragmentation, now unified under a single crown. Prussia had not just won a war. It had birthed a nation. But how did it come to this? Just 6 months earlier, Napoleon III had ridden confidently into battle. France, believing herself the master of Europe, was certain she would crush the growing Prussian threat. Instead, she had collapsed. The French emperor was now a prisoner. His empire had crumbled. Paris, once radiant and defiant, was surrounded, cold, and starving. And as the French people endured the long, brutal siege of their capital, inside Versailles, their enemies were building something new. Otto von Bismarck, chancellor, strategist, and architect of German unity, had chosen this location carefully. It wasn't just practical, it was poetic. Versailles, where the Sun King Louis XIV once ruled supreme, would now host the rise of a new star, Germany. There had been resistance among the German princes. Bavaria, Württemberg, Saxony, all proud in their own identities, had not wanted to yield their crowns to one emperor. But war had changed everything. The victories against France, at Sedan, at Metz, at Paris, had fused the German states together in shared blood and shared pride. Bismarck knew that war forged steel. And with each Prussian victory, the idea of a united Germany became less a dream and more a reality. In the Hall of Mirrors, Bismarck wore a simple military coat. His iron presence contrasted with the golden splendor around him. He had orchestrated this day as carefully as a conductor leads a symphony. And like any great composer, he had made sure every note, every word, every gesture was precisely timed. Wilhelm was reluctant, a man of discipline, not grandeur. But even he could not deny the tide of history sweeping over him. The title emperor was foreign to his cautious temperament. He feared the ambitions it might spark, the revolts it could invite. Yet standing in Versailles, surrounded by victorious troops and crowned by his fellow German princes, he could do nothing but accept the weight of destiny. Outside, in the streets of Paris, the mood was very different. The French people, gaunt from hunger and weary from bombardment, had little knowledge of the ceremony inside Versailles. But when word began to spread, slowly, in whispers at first, of a German emperor being crowned on French soil, something inside the national spirit snapped. This wasn't just a defeat. It was a wound to pride, to identity, to the soul of a nation. France had been beaten before, at Waterloo, at Leipzig, but never like this. Never had a foreign empire been born within her palaces. The humiliation was complete. The very walls that once echoed with the footsteps of Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette now bore silent witness to the rise of Germany. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Even in Berlin, not all were celebrating. There were voices who warned of arrogance, of overreach. Germany had been united, yes, but through war, not peace. Through fear, not consensus. What would this unity cost in the years to come? For now, though, such questions were buried beneath the thunder of drums and the glint of bayonets. The war was not over, not officially. Paris still held out. French resistance still flickered. But after this day, no one could doubt the outcome. The birth of the German Empire had changed the balance of Europe. Forever, the world watched in awe and fear. Back inside the Hall of Mirrors, as the applause faded and the cold settled in once more, Wilhelm turned from the assembled guests. He was now Kaiser Wilhelm I. But in his eyes, there was no jubilation. Only wait. Outside, as Prussian cannons still loomed over the rooftops of Paris, families huddled in cellars. Dogs, cats, any animal that could be caught, had already disappeared from the streets. Even the zoo was emptied. The city was starving. The people were desperate. But even in the depth of suffering, a stubborn flame still burned. The French were down, but they were not broken. Some whispered of revenge. Others wept in silence. Many simply waited for something, anything, to bring this nightmare to an end. The crowning of Wilhelm was more than just a military insult. It was a psychological blow. It meant that even if France survived the siege, she had already lost the future. Across Europe, newspapers ran with the story. Headlines declared the dawn of a new age. Germany had arrived, not as an idea, but as a force. In London, politicians debated what this shift meant for Britain's place on the continent. In Vienna and Rome, leaders reconsidered their alliances. In St. Petersburg, the Tsar observed with cautious interest. But in France, a new chapter of bitterness began to write itself. People carved out memories of this day, etched them into their hearts, not just as a loss, but as a betrayal. Versailles had become a scar, and scars, as history often proves, do not fade. They harden. From school children to soldiers, a new generation of French citizens would grow up with the image of a German emperor crowned in the seat of French kings. It was not something easily forgiven, nor easily forgotten. And so, as the sun set over Versailles and cast long shadows through the Hall of Mirrors, no one could have imagined that this very room, this stage of triumph, would one day host another kind of reckoning. Not in 1871, but in the years to come. Because history, like a wheel, turns. And France, though humiliated, was far from finished. The guns were still loaded, the wounds still raw, the war still lingering in every street and home. And somewhere, deep in the soul of a nation, vengeance began to stir. The German Empire had been born. But peace? Chapter 25, Paris surrenders. The silence before dawn carried a weight heavier than any cannonade. For months, the city had endured unrelenting siege, bombardments that shattered nights, starvation that hollowed bellies, and a cold that seeped into every bone. Now, as the first pale light crept over the rooftops, Paris stood on the edge of breaking, not just in stone, but in spirit. The surrender was not a sudden thunderclap, but a slow, painful unraveling. The capital, once the heart of revolution and culture, was now emaciated, exhausted, and broken. For nearly 5 months, Paris had been surrounded. The Prussian armies encircled the city like an iron fist, pressing tighter with every passing day. Roads were cut, supplies stopped, hope dwindled. The city streets, once alive with laughter and debate, were now filled with the whispers of hunger and fear. Every meal was rationed to the last crumb. Mothers hid their pain behind weary smiles. Soldiers, once proud and resplendent in their blue coats, shuffled in ragged lines, their faces gaunt, their eyes dull with fatigue. The decision to surrender was a bitter one that tore through the hearts of Parisians like a blade. The government of national defense, formed in the ashes of the fallen empire, had struggled to keep the city's resolve alive. But as starvation tightened its grip and the bombardment showed no mercy, even the fiercest patriots began to question, how much more could they endure? Inside the Hôtel de Ville, the nerve center of the city's beleaguered leadership, voices clashed in urgent debate. General Trochu, once resolute in his determination to hold the city at all costs, found his strength waning. Reports came in, children fainting from hunger, factories shuttered, hospitals overwhelmed with the sick and wounded. The morale of the troops was fracturing. The people's endurance was crumbling. Outside, the streets told the true story. Shops stood empty, windows boarded up. The smell of smoke from burning wood mingled with the acrid scent of gunpowder. Citizens formed silent lines for their meager rations, often less than half a loaf of bread per day. Rats, once pests, had become a source of desperate food. Pets disappeared, and even the zoo had been emptied, its animals slaughtered for survival. As winter tightened its icy grip, the cold was as much an enemy as the Prussians beyond the walls. Fires dwindled to embers. Children shivered in threadbare clothes. The city's hospitals, understaffed and undersupplied, struggled to care for the sick. Doctors wrote grim letters. Pneumonia and scurvy spread like wildfire. The once vibrant city was reduced to a hushed, trembling shadow of itself. The surrender talks began in secret, shrouded in uncertainty and fear. Messengers crossed no man's land under the watchful eyes of enemy snipers. Each letter, each whispered conversation, carried the weight of a nation's dignity hanging by a thread. The Prussians demanded unconditional surrender, terms that many in Paris found unbearable. But to continue was to condemn the city to slow death. When the news finally reached the masses, a wave of silent grief swept through the streets. There were no cheers, no celebrations, only the quiet resignation of a people who had given everything but could no longer fight. Parents held their children close, trying to shield them from the crushing reality. Soldiers folded their flags, faces etched with sorrow and shame. The day of surrender was shrouded in cold fog and gray skies, a fitting backdrop for a city steeped in sorrow. Parisians watched from windows and doorsteps as Prussian troops marched through their streets, the clatter of boots a harsh drumbeat against the silence. Some turned away in tears. Others stood stiffly, pride intact despite defeat. In the days that followed, the scars of war were everywhere. Buildings lay in ruins, homes abandoned. The Seine ran dark with debris. The once grand boulevards felt like haunted corridors. Yet amid the rubble, life stubbornly persisted. Vendors set up stalls with what little food remained. Children played quietly, their laughter fragile but real. The spirit of Paris, though battered, had not been extinguished. The surrender was not the end of the story. It marked a new beginning, fraught with challenges, rebuilding, and reflection. The fall of Paris was a wound that would take generations to heal, a memory etched deeply into the soul of France. And as the city struggled to rise from the ashes, the world watched, knowing that the echoes of this siege would shape the future of Europe forever. The war had ended, but the consequences, the losses, the pride, the lessons, were only just beginning. What would become of France? Of Germany? Of a continent forever changed by the fires of this brutal conflict? The answers, like the city itself, lay in the uncertain dawn that stretched ahead. Chapter 26. The Treaty of Frankfurt. The war had ended, but the wounds it inflicted were far from healing. In the grand, ornate city of Frankfurt, far from the battlefields and broken streets of Paris, the victors and the vanquished gathered to draw the new map of Europe, one that would forever change the lives of millions. The Treaty of Frankfurt was not just a piece of paper. It was a verdict of humiliation, a blueprint for resentment, and a symbol of a shattered France forced to bow to German power. On a cold May day in 1871, the representatives of France and the newly proclaimed German Empire came together in the city's grand halls. The mood was tense, heavy with the gravity of what was to be decided. France, exhausted and defeated, faced terms dictated by the sharp minds and stern wills of Bismarck and the German High Command. The atmosphere was thick with silence and unspoken anger. The treaty's terms were brutal. France was forced to cede the rich, industrial regions of Alsace and part of Lorraine, territories soaked in history, culture, and blood, to Germany. This loss was more than just land. It was a blow to French identity and pride. The people who lived there, many of whom considered themselves French, were suddenly subjects of a foreign empire. Families were split, languages forbidden, and allegiances tested. For the French, the loss was a bitter pill, swallowed only under duress. Alongside the territorial loss came a crushing financial penalty. France was ordered to pay an indemnity of 5 billion francs, a staggering sum for any nation, let alone one reeling from war. This payment was a clear message. The price of defeat was not just humiliation, but economic strain. The indemnity was meant to cripple France's ability to retaliate, to buy time for Germany to secure its newfound dominance. Yet, in the hearts of many French citizens, it only fueled the desire for revanche, the revenge that would simmer beneath the surface for decades. The treaty also stipulated the occupation of parts of France by German troops until the indemnity was fully paid, a constant reminder of defeat and submission. German soldiers marched through French towns and cities, their presence a daily humiliation. This occupation disrupted daily life, drained local resources, and deepened the divide between the two nations. But the Treaty of Frankfurt was more than just a settlement between two countries. It was a symbol of a new European order. The German Empire stood at the center, powerful and unified for the first time in centuries. France, once a dominant force, was humbled and isolated. This shift rattled the established balance of power, forcing other nations to reconsider their alliances and strategies. For the ordinary people, the treaty's impact was immediate and personal. Soldiers returned to find their homes changed, neighbors turned strangers, and futures uncertain. Farmers and factory workers faced new taxes and economic hardship as France struggled to pay its debt. Children learned in schools that their country's borders had changed, their textbooks rewritten to reflect a painful new reality. Despite the harsh terms, the treaty planted seeds of hope and resilience. French politicians and citizens vowed not to forget Alsace and Lorraine, not to accept defeat as permanent. The idea of reclaiming lost territory became a rallying cry, a unifying purpose for the fractured nation. This spirit would shape France's politics, culture, and military ambitions for decades to come. On the German side, the treaty was celebrated as a triumph of diplomacy and military might. Bismarck's vision of a united Germany was realized, and the empire's status on the world stage was secured. Yet, even among the victors, there were whispers of caution. The treaty's harshness risked sowing deep resentment that could one day erupt into conflict again. The fragile peace was built on uneasy foundations. As the ink dried on the Treaty of Frankfurt, Europe watched with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The war had ended, but the consequences rippled far beyond the battlefield. Borders had shifted, alliances reformed, and old rivalries reignited. The treaty was both an ending and a beginning, a chapter closed with a heavy hand, but a story far from over. In the quiet moments after the negotiations, behind the grand doors and polished tables, the leaders knew this peace was temporary. The ghosts of war lingered in the hearts of the French people and the ambitions of German statesmen. The Treaty of Frankfurt was a victory, yes, but it was also a promise that the storm had not passed. It was merely a moment of calm before the next great upheaval. And so, the story of the Franco-Prussian War concluded not with a whisper, but with a challenge, one that Europe would grapple with for decades, shaping the fate of nations and setting the stage for the conflicts yet to come. Chapter 27. The Seeds of Future Wars. The war had ended, the guns fell silent, and the battlefield lay strewn with the broken dreams of two great nations. But peace, as fragile as it was, carried a weight far heavier than the mere absence of conflict. The Treaty of Frankfurt, signed under cold, gray skies in the spring of 1871, marked an official end to hostilities, yet it planted a bitter seed deep within the heart of France, one that would grow, festering with resentment and a burning desire for revenge. For the French people, the loss of Alsace and Lorraine was not simply a territorial concession. It was a gut-wrenching blow to their national pride and identity. These lands, rich in culture, history, and industry, had been French for centuries. Families who had lived there for generations suddenly found themselves subjects of a foreign power, their loyalties torn apart by an invisible but iron border. The towns and villages that had once hummed with the familiar rhythms of French life were now under German rule. The languages spoken, the flags flown, even the lessons taught to children were changed with an unyielding hand. In cafes and markets across France, the memory of this loss was whispered, mourned, and ignited a flame of bitter determination. This feeling was not limited to private sorrow. It rippled through the corridors of power and echoed loudly in the streets. Politicians seized upon the public grief and anger, stoking the fires of revanche, the desire for revenge that would shape French policy for decades. It became a rallying cry for a wounded nation, a promise that this defeat was only temporary. From Paris to provincial towns, the vow to reclaim Alsace and Lorraine was etched into the national consciousness, shaping the way the French saw themselves and their future. But the cost of defeat extended beyond pride and land. The financial indemnity imposed by Germany was staggering, 5 billion francs, a sum so immense it threatened to cripple the already shattered French economy. The payments were made with grim determination, often requiring sacrifices that fell hardest on ordinary citizens. Factories slowed, Farmers felt the strain, and the once vibrant pulse of French industry faltered under the weight of debt. Yet, even as France struggled to pay, it did so swiftly, fueled by a fierce determination to end the humiliation and to rebuild the nation's strength. Rebuilding was not just economic, it was military. The defeat exposed glaring weaknesses in the French army, weaknesses that the country moved swiftly to rectify. New fortifications rose along the borders, new laws expanded the size of the army, and military schools worked overtime to prepare a new generation of officers. The French people, still smarting from the sting of defeat and occupation, supported these efforts with a mixture of hope and steely resolve. The scars of war ran deep, but they fueled an unyielding resolve to never again suffer such humiliation. Meanwhile, across the Rhine, the German Empire stood proudly united for the first time in centuries. The proclamation of Wilhelm I as emperor in the opulent Hall of Mirrors at Versailles was not merely a symbolic victory. It was the realization of Bismarck's relentless vision, a powerful, unified Germany commanding respect and fear throughout Europe. Yet, even amid triumph, Bismarck was keenly aware of the dangers ahead. The treaty's harsh terms had sown deep resentment in France, and while diplomacy sought to isolate France from potential allies, the embers of hatred burned brightly, threatening future conflict. The new European order was fragile. Germany, now the continent's dominant power, had shifted the balance irrevocably, but that power came with responsibility and risk. France, humiliated yet defiant, looked outward and inward, rebuilding alliances and preparing for the inevitable day when the scales might be tipped once more. The Franco-Prussian War had not settled old disputes. It had merely transformed them, setting the stage for an arms race and diplomatic maneuvering that would dominate the decades to come. For the people caught between these great powers, life carried on amidst the uneasy peace. Soldiers who had faced the horrors of battle returned to towns marked by loss and change. Families mourned those who never came home and struggled to understand a world forever altered by war. Children learned new histories, told from a perspective shaped by defeat or victory. The trauma of the war was etched not only in politics and treaties, but in the very fabric of society. As Europe moved forward, the consequences of the Franco-Prussian War lingered like a shadow. The bitter peace forged in Frankfurt was a fragile ceasefire, a calm before the storm. Old grudges, nationalistic fervor, and the scars of defeat simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the spark that would ignite another, even greater conflict. The war had changed borders and governments, but it had also changed the hearts of men and nations. The Franco-Prussian War was not simply a chapter in history. It was a prologue to the 20th century's great upheavals. The seeds sown in those years, resentment, revenge, and rivalry, would grow into the devastating conflagration of World War I, shaping the course of history in ways no one could yet imagine. The echoes of 1870 and 71 would ring out loud and clear for decades, a grim reminder that the cost of war is not measured only in lives lost, but in the wounds left behind. And so, as the guns fell silent and the treaties were signed, the story was far from over. Europe stood at a crossroads, its future uncertain and its past heavy with lessons learned in blood. The flames of vengeance and hope flickered side by side, warning that peace is often only temporary, and history has a way of repeating itself when its wounds are left unhealed. The end for now.